that the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, the committee shall commence the report writing phase of its review of the 2012 special report of the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario on Orange Air Ambulance and related services, the review, during the committee's first meeting of the fall meeting period of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and that the committee shall continue the report writing phase of the review during the fall meeting period of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and that the committee shall complete its final report on the review by no later than 60 days following the committee's first meeting of the fall meeting period of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. And just note that the motion is deliberately worded to take account of the fact that we don't know precisely when this committee will first meet in the fall. So it's worded to accommodate that unknown, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. And please.
Chair.
Excuse me, I'd like to speak to the motion,
okay,
if I may, Chair.
Go ahead.
Well, if I might, it might be
Excuse me, I think I've got the floor if it's my motion.
She does have the floor, so go ahead.
This committee has now spent over 4 months reviewing the Auditor General's special report on Orange. We've heard over 70 hours of testimony from over 50 witnesses. We've now recalled some witnesses twice, in one case even 3 times. The committee has heard from the Auditor General, the Minister of Health and Long-Term Care, deputy ministers and public servants from across government, former ministers of health and long-term care, former deputy ministers and public servants from across government, the management and board of Orange, former management and board of Orange, frontline Orange paramedics, former frontline Orange paramedics, legal counsel, former legal counsel, consultants, former consultants, and many others in a comprehensive examination of the facts surrounding the events that occurred at Orange and the recommendations provided by the Auditor General. We need to play a role in shaping the public policy decisions surrounding how the government and Orange move forward to improve the province's air ambulance service. That has traditionally been the role of this committee, which is to provide further advice on implementing the recommendations of the Auditor General. To do that, we have to begin the task, which I agree will be a difficult one, of parsing through the hundreds of pages of testimony we've heard and thousands of pages of documents we've received and putting together some findings and recommendations. As I said, the purpose of this committee's work is to review the Auditor General's report and make further recommendations on how to strengthen oversight and accountability moving forward. We have a responsibility to Ontario taxpayers, given the amount of money that we have spent reviewing this, to provide some value added to the taxpayers in terms of implementing the auditor's report and implementing and setting a path, a policy path moving forward. I hope my colleagues will support moving ahead with report writing so that we can be part of the solution when it comes to moving our air ambulance program forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Klees?
I'll defer to Ms. Jelena.
Ms. Jelena?
You're deferring to me?
Yes.
No, I'm okay. I have no comments. I'm ready to vote.
I have no comments either, other than to say that I find this motion offensive, that the government would choose to shut down these hearings. I think that we have a very long list of witnesses that still have not been called. They are on the list. There are more questions now than there were when we started. And for the government to suggest that we shut down this debate now is shutting down debate. I think the last thing that we should have happen in this committee or anywhere in this legislature is that we shut down debate when there's much more to be heard. And so I would ask that you call the question.
Okay, very well. All in favor of the motion?
Mr. Moridi, Ms. Sandals, Mr. Zimmer, Mr. McNeely,
Opposed?
Mr. Barrett, Mr. Klees, Ms. Jalina, Mr. Singh.
So it's a tie vote, and as the chair, I'm not going to make a decision that the committee cannot make on its own, so I will vote against the motion. And I would also point out that this motion is not binding on the committee, that they very well may have new members come the fall, and at that time when the new members or same members are on the committee, they can, in subcommittee, decide how they wish to proceed, and that very well may be to proceed to as is suggested in the motion, to report writing. Very good. Yes, Ms. Jones.
Subsequent to this, we had directed our very capable researcher to start to do kind of summary of what we have heard and do those summaries by themes. And I was wondering if, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you be willing to share how this work is going and if you need any direction in writing this report?
This would probably be a very good time if Ray is organized to be able to give an update on what he has planned.
Accomplished to date. And I can do this fairly quickly, so I won't get into a long discussion. And we had a chance yesterday just to briefly touch on where where I'm going slowly. And I would say too, just to preface it, to go back to Ms. Sandals' comment, is I'm thinking along the lines of a public accounts committee and a public accounts committee report, as we've done over the decades. So that format is what I'm working towards, if the committee's in agreement with that. With respect to, I'll just let France finish off here. I think she wants to hear this. Yeah.
Intensely.
So just very, I tend to approach this in a very kind of a numbers way as to where I am and where I want to be by the end of the process. Right now, we have, but when we finish off tomorrow, we'll have had 15 days of hearings. I have finished week 10 in terms of the summary. So when we finish tomorrow, I'll be turning to week 11. And hopefully, within the next 2 weeks, have completed that summary. Now, that's a summary that we had talked about of being a couple of, maybe a month ago, we said, well, what we really need to kind of bridge from where we are to where we want to go is a document that really identifies the issues and observations. It's not a report, but it's just more of a checklist. And it's, as you were saying, Franz, it's broken down by themes. And I think my first pass at it, I think I probably had about 20 items, from cabin safety and patient safety to the bond and on and on and on. So all of that information just very quickly is gathered up by subject area. And then I'll have a longer report on that, and I would use that at the end of the day, not that you're necessarily interested in this part, but I would use that information, which would be a longer document, maybe 150 pages, to actually work on a final report. But what I would give to you when I finish off these 15 days of hearings is a document, as I say, that's compressed, and it'll probably be about, I would say, 40 or 50 pages long. But at least by that point, we can go through and we can look at it and say, well, yeah, these are the main 15 or 20 areas, and this is what we want to focus on. As Ms. Sanders was saying this morning, it's important that I frame that in the context of the auditor's report. But I would say, in doing that, there's going to be kind of miscellaneous and overlap. In other words, matters that weren't addressed in the auditor's report were addressed by the committee. So we'll start off with the auditor's report and run our issues and observations in parallel to that to see where Mr. McCarter finished off and what he recommended and what the committee has heard, and then go into kind of miscellaneous and new materials. And that'll have to be framed in a different format without the preamble of the auditor's observations and recommendations. So that's where I am. And in terms of timeline, as I say, my objective prior to the discussion that we've just had this morning was to wrap this issues and observation paper up in September, so that it'll go along to committee for its first meeting. And at that point, presumably, you would look at it and make decisions as to where we're going to go. And as I say, not to kind of preempt what was discussed this morning, but that was prior to this discussion, that's where I thought I was going, so I'm in your hands on this. But so I'm making progress, and I think getting to where we want to be as far as an interim document. Hopefully that's Franz.
I thank you for the update. Ray and I had talked before, so I already knew what he was going to say. But then you added a few. The part I think could have value at this point is that if you could sort of give us a summary page as to what are the themes that you're going to be writing on. I understand that it'll be based on the auditor's report. This is why we're here. But at the same time, I think this discussion within the committee could be useful. Liz and I were on a select committee for mental health.
Right.
This is the process that we used there, where our first report was basically what have we heard. So the work you're doing now is very much along the same line, what have we heard, but depending on which headers you put on those, it would be, I think, a worthwhile exercise for you to share with us what are going to be the different headers in that what have we heard report, so we could have a discussion on this to make sure that the work that you do, you don't have to redo. And then my second question is that I would be interested, and I don't know if the other members of the committee would also be interested, in you sharing that with us as soon as it is ready, so that if it's a 40 to 50 page document, so we could read it and have a little bit of time to read it and digest it. So rather than wait for the next committee to share, as soon as it would be ready, you would share it with all of us. So I put that on the table.
Yeah, and certainly that would be the case. In other words, when this document is ready in September, that it would go out, and then we'll wait well in advance. I mean, the minimum we always had was a week prior to the next meeting that a document would go out for your review. In this case, it would probably be longer than that, so you'll have a chance to kind of wade through it. With respect to the first question you had raised on the more of the themes and the kind of the chapter headings, quite frankly, I'm working on that right now. I don't have it, so in other words, I don't have it today.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, but even if you just bring us something really, really broad strokes for tomorrow morning, maybe when we're all there, I think it is a discussion that will be useful to you, so that, and while the auditor is there also, just so that we all frame it in a way that if we had something in mind,
right,
then you have an opportunity to hear this.
Okay.
Before you put pen to paper.
Auditor General?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that might be helpful, I know Ray mentioned kind of following the outline of our report, but you might find, you want a different outline, and I think what you're getting at is almost like a one-pager, really like a table of contents. Like you might want to talk about the business model or some of the things that we didn't cover in the report. And I think what you're getting at is maybe just almost a one-pager table of contents, so we can at least look at the major areas and say, yeah, I think this is hitting the mark.
Exactly.
I do have that. As I say, it's rough, so I'll see what I can get together. But as Mr. McCarter said, my list, in addition to what Mr. McCarter has done, gets into more matters of corporate structure, kind of business planning, and even going to one of Mr. Zimmer's point, the corporate culture. Which seems to be, I mean, that's a theme you'd want to pursue, but the corporate culture seems to be an important part of this whole discussion and debate. As I say, with the corporate structure, those topics, and as I say, I'll do my best to get something down on paper at some point today, and we can maybe spend a couple of minutes tomorrow. But I appreciate your time on this.
Yeah, and Franz mentioned working on the select committee, but the other thing that public accounts did, where we had more extended hearings, and what usually happens at public accounts, was when we did e-health. And it was really, really helpful when we were doing the report writing on that to have Ray do exactly what he's doing right now, which is to summarize the testimony according to the different themes and strands. And then it helped us organize, and it also brought us back to where it's an issue that the auditor has covered. It helped us bring it back to the auditor's report, because we are doing our work is based certainly as the major piece on the work that the auditor has done. So it was really helpful having the testimony organized for us.
This, and I spoke with Ms. Sandals yesterday about e-health. This is the e-health report, which is a standard kind of public accounts format. I think the response from the ministry was probably about 4 times the length of our report. But anyway, that's so this is the format for public accounts. And as I say, if I'm in the committee's hands, if we use this tried and true format, that's fine. And anyway, I'll get back to you kind of ASAP on that table of contents and see what it looks like.
Just, are the other members of the committee interested in this, or? Yeah.
I think this is the first step. I mean, regardless of how the vote turns out, somehow we have to figure out, we're only value added if we can consolidate what we thought and bring further recommendations around how can we make this work better in the future, how can we avoid the mistakes that happened in the past. And if we're going to be value added, we need to be starting to think, and the way we start to think is with Ray's summary of the testimony organized in a way that we can do something useful with it in terms of having an intelligent, thoughtful discussion.
Okay, any other comments?
So will we have something then by way of an outline tomorrow?
We're talking about the one pager.
Absolutely. The table of content, like what the auditor has suggested.
That's right. So, as I say, this is going on kind of as we're sitting here. But I do have a table of contents that's drafted up. I'll just have to get it shaped up a bit, kind of over the next 6 or 7 hours, if I can, so we can. But would it be all right to have it tomorrow morning, first thing, or would you like to have it at 7 p.m. tonight?
If you have it today, sure, share it today. But what I'm also asking my colleague is, would you be willing to come in 15 minutes early tomorrow morning so that we can have even half an hour early, so we can have a discussion on the table of content, so it is clear that the work that you're doing is work that you won't have to redo.
That's any time.
So if you could, in that case, if you could have it for us tonight, gives us a chance to review that and come back with some feedback tomorrow morning.
Okay, very well. So we'll start at 8:30 tomorrow morning, and we'll take a 5-minute recess before we start these proceedings. call the committee to order then, it being after 9 o'clock. And our first witness this morning is Mr. Ron Sapsworth. And I'd like to call him forward and confirm that you've received the letter for a person coming before the committee, testifying before the committee?
Yes, I did, Mr. Chair.
Very well. And our clerk will have you do either an affirmation or oath.
So the Bible's in front of you there, Mr. Sapsworth. Perfect. Mr. Sapsworth, do you solemnly swear that the evidence you shall give to this committee touching the subject of the present inquiry should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
And I understand you have an opening statement, so please feel free to do that, and then we'll move to questions.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, my name is Ron Sapsworth, and I was from March of 2005 until December of 2009 the Deputy Minister of Health and Long-Term Care for the province. During that time, there was great change in the healthcare system, but also in the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care itself. One of the key directions pursued was the divestment of a number of direct health services from ministry operation, air ambulance being one of them. Air ambulance was the first in a long list, including drug benefit registration, OHIP registration and card production, public health laboratory services, 3 psychiatric hospitals, including Oak Ridge's the high-security forensic facility, and the closure of 6 regional offices of the ministry as a result of the introduction of local health integration networks. During this period, the staff of the ministry went from approximately 7,200 full-time equivalents to 3,800 full-time equivalents. The object of these changes was to put the operation and direction of these services under the authority of corporations that could provide more focused and expert leadership, and to focus the core of the ministry's future role. I offer this context to simply illustrate that the divestment of air ambulance services, while well underway when I arrived at the ministry, was part of a much larger policy agenda. The air ambulance services was divested to the corporation that was to become Ornge, not as a Crown agency, but as an independent corporation. The ministry designated this corporation as the provider of air ambulance services and treated it as another of its many transfer payment agencies. There were expectations that it would operate in similar fashion to other health agencies, such as hospitals or CCACs or mental health programs. It was a non-profit corporation providing public services in the public interest and not seen to be operating in private interest. So the apparent movement from operation in the public interest to one of private interest is for me the most surprising and concerning. My direct knowledge of the details of the issues identified in the auditor's report is somewhat limited, and I appear today not as the Deputy Minister responding on behalf of the Ministry to the report, nor having had access to the information of the Ministry in answering the many questions that ensue. Nevertheless, I will do my best to answer the committee's questions and to assist you in your inquiries as best as I can, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sapsworth, and we'll move to the opposition for the first question, Mr. Klees.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. Sapsworth.
Good morning.
I'm sure that your life is very busy these days.
Yes, sir, always.
Negotiations with the government. How are things going?
We're moving slowly.
Making progress?
One hopes.
Sir, I'd like to start with a discussion of the performance agreement, which established the basis of the relationship between Ornge, known at that time as the Ontario Air Ambulance Corporation, I guess, and subsequently become known as Ornge, and the government. I'm assuming that you were involved in the negotiation of that performance agreement. Is that correct?
No, I wasn't involved directly in the negotiation of the agreement.
Okay, but you were the Assistant Deputy Minister at the time that the agreement was signed?
No, I was the Deputy Minister at that time.
The Deputy Minister?
Correct.
Okay. And it was signed by George Smitherman and Mr. Mazza?
Correct.
Who led the negotiations for the Ministry of Health?
Well, let me explain. The negotiations for the divestment went on over a long period of time. the better part of a year, I would suspect. So the first time I became directly aware of it was in the fall of 2005, which was just prior, I think, to the government's decision to finalize the divestment. I had started at the ministry in the spring of that year, and so the negotiations, the details of the agreement and so forth were well underway when I arrived at the ministry. So the first time I became aware of it was at the final approval, where we were going through final review and sign-off before it went to Cabinet for final approval.
So as the deputy, did you review that document personally?
In general terms, the way the ministry worked, of course, is that the details of that would be developed through the division of the ministry, in this case emergency services, up through the lawyers were involved. I'm not aware of all the details of how it came about, but in the final approval I would have reviewed the generalities of the service agreement. I think there were financial transfers, there were regulations that were involved at the time, so a general review of all that package of material.
So who would the lead negotiator have been for the ministry in putting that contract together?
I have to say, the lead, I'm not absolutely clear. It would have been through the emergency division. So one of the
Malcolm
ADMs,
Bates or
Malcolm would have been involved. The ADM at the time, whether it was maybe perhaps Hugh MacLeod, had some involvement with the details of it.
Okay. Do you recall who was involved in that negotiation on the Ornge side?
No.
Okay. When this went to Cabinet for approval, I'm assuming that you would have reviewed the MB-20 at that time?
Yes, in general terms, correct.
And given the nature of this transaction, given this was a significant policy decision to divest the air ambulance service, what as deputy were the key issues that you were looking for to give you comfort that you would sign off on that MB-20?
Well, several things. To make sure that the financial arrangements were in order, so the amounts of money that were being transferred within a budget, that it was being situated under the Ambulance Act and the regulations were appropriate to situate the delivery of the service there. And then the general outline of the service agreement, the general terms of that, the expectations about service delivery.
One of the cornerstones of that MB-20 was an assurance to Cabinet that the Ministry of Health would continue in a strong oversight role, that while the service delivery is being divested, the responsibility of oversight would stay with the Ministry of Health. Do you recall that being raised as an issue by the Minister or by others within the Ministry of Health?
Not specifically. If I can, the context for it from my point of view would be a divestment to a transfer payment agency. So many of the relationships that the ministry has with, or does have and continues to have, did have, would form the same kind of relationship as would be expected with air ambulance. So budget allocations, general policy direction, compliance questions in terms of quality and certification, those sorts of things. So in a similar vein, the relationship that would exist between the ministry and, say, a hospital would be the expectation in terms of oversight and supervision.
I'm surprised that the issue of oversight would not have been front and center in making this decision and in signing off. I mean, this is a very important service. To simply hand over, I think it was the agreement, if I read it correctly, we're signing over the assets for $1, we're giving carte blanche to this organization. And I would have thought that around the cabinet table, certainly in your office as deputy, that there would have been considerable discussion about how government would ensure that service standards are maintained, that accountability is front and center, that and you're suggesting, or at least I'm getting the message from you, that was not really a big issue, that it was kind of an assumption that that would simply take place.
No, don't misunderstand me.
Well,
clearly, the
clarify,
ministry had oversight responsibilities. I don't deny that. And the service agreement explained a number of, I don't know all the details as I sit here now, but explained a number of accountabilities in terms of service and provision and standards, the Ambulance Act and its regulations, which covered issues of service provision and qualifications and all those things. Clearly, the ministry would continue to be responsible for ensuring compliance with all of those parts, and that forms a major part of what I would call oversight.
The performance agreement, there's been quite a bit of discussion. If you've been following these hearings, you also know that the Auditor General's report, which I'm assuming you've read, made reference to the lack of oversight on the part of the Ministry of Health, which accounted for this organization making a wrong turn. I think we all agree that the original concept in terms of bringing more efficiency to this service and coordinating services was well-intentioned. And as you indicate in your opening statement, that the apparent movement from operation in the public interest to one of private interest, and I'd actually put it to self-interest, was a surprise to you. It concerns us greatly that is the direction that it took. Mm-hmm. What I'm interested in knowing is how that could happen, given that there was not only the performance agreement, but we had the Ambulance Act. There's other legislation. You yourself indicated that the expectation was that it would operate in a similar fashion to other health facilities, such as hospitals, for example, that somehow this well-intentioned policy decision could go so wrong. Why is it that the Ministry of Health, or let me rephrase this, which department at the Ministry of Health would have been charged with the oversight responsibility of Ornge?
The Emergency Services Branch.
We have had some testimony here from Mr. Malcolm Bates concerning that issue, that apparently there was frustration within that Emergency Health Services branch, who knew full well what their responsibility was. And they wanted to carry out that oversight responsibility. But the testimony that we have from Mr. Bates is that he was directed to stand down and to allow Mr. Mazza to carry on, because essentially Mr. Bates' authority was overridden. That Mr. Bates was basically told in no uncertain terms that he should be doing whatever Dr. Mazza instructed him to do. So we now have this new entity out here that was created through the divestment. We had oversight responsibility with the Ministry of Health, but the very department that was charged with exercising that responsibility was told that they're now subservient to that organization, to Mr. Mazza and his organization. How could that come about?
I have no idea. I mean, I don't know what Mr. Bates would be referring to in terms of that direction, but certainly no direction like that ever emanated from my office or from my point of view. The ministry has clear responsibilities that were defined in the service agreement, and if the suggestion is Mr. Bates was directed not to, is that how I understand what you're saying?
Yes.
Not to live up to the service agreement? Then I don't understand where that direction would have come from.
Well, Mr. Bates indicated in his testimony that it came from Hugh MacLeod, and actually tabled emails here that gave very clear direction that Mr. Mazza is now in charge. And I was wondering if Mr. MacLeod would have made that decision unilaterally, or if perhaps that was a direction from somewhere higher up, which I guess would have put it into your office, or the minister's office. And you're telling us you have no knowledge of any direction.
Certainly no direction of that sort would have come from me at any time, on any matter.
Did you ever meet Mr. Mazza?
I met him once for a short meeting, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. I'd never met him before, so it was really more of an introductory meeting with him.
Was that before or after you signed, the deal was signed?
Oh, that was after.
That was after. And did you know him at all prior to that, or know of him? Did you know of his...
I didn't know him, certainly. I'd certainly heard his name, and I've been in the health system a long time, so I knew his name. I knew he was expert in sort of emergency medicine and worked through Sunnybrook, but that would be the extent of my...
Do you recall how the decision was made to entrust Chris Mazza with this responsibility?
Those decisions were made long before I arrived at the ministry. As I said, the discussion about the divestment had been decided long before I got there. The negotiations started over the course of, I guess, 2005, 4 or 5. And when I first became engaged with the file was in the fall of 2005, when they were finalizing the package for Cabinet.
Knowing what you know about the performance agreement and how that divestment was to roll out,
yes.
Was there ever any discussion that this new organization, Ornge, would end up actually owning helicopters, owning fixed-wing aircraft, operating their own aircraft division? Was that ever contemplated? Do you recall any discussions that was part of the strategy or that overall plan?
At that particular time? No.
It was never contemplated?
Not to my knowledge. It certainly wasn't drawn to my attention, no. Okay. If there were discussion.
Right. Certainly we've heard other testimony that supports that as well, that was never contemplated. That may be one of the issues that took things down the wrong path. We have a lot more information, of course, to glean as to how we got to that point. But can you tell us, in very simple terms, what that divestment was to look like and why that step was taken to divest the air ambulance service?
There were, I would say, at least 2 strong reasons. I think there had been identified problems with the existing service, the way it was organized. I think in terms of previous audit reports or external reports, it had pointed out a number of issues in terms of service and distribution of aircraft and availability. I can't remember all the details, but I think there were some fundamental issues around how the air ambulance service was organized and operated in the first place, and I think that discussion started probably in 2003, a fairly long time ago. So that would be one reason. There were issues around how it was currently operated, and I think the model that was put forward was to create an organization whose specialty would be in this business and to create an organization that would spend full time focused on air ambulance and not just another service of the Ministry of Health among all the many, many responsibilities of the ministry. So to me, that was a principal reason to create an agency to spend full time focused on it as a specialty organization. And then I think the second, which is probably an adjunct, was this more general notion that I referred to, that the Ministry of Health itself needed to move out of direct health operational services as a general approach to the role of the ministry. And so, as I illustrated, over the course of the years I was there were several direct services, health care services that were divested to external corporations, non-profit, much in the same vein as air ambulance. So those would be the two reasons I would offer for the rationale behind the divestment.
Okay. As we discussed previously, one of the things that the ministry never contemplated giving up was the oversight responsibility and holding this organization to account. As a deputy minister, you have a great deal of experience within government. In your opinion, if there was a sense that something was going wrong within that organization, what authority does a minister have to intervene with any transfer agency?
I can think of 4.
Okay. I'd like to, and I'll borrow some time because this is...
First, legislative provisions. So first you'd look to statutory authority. Some of it is specific, some of it's general. Regulation, under legislation, if there are specific regulations conferring authority or abilities to intervene. The third would be monetary. The government controls the purse strings of every transfer payment agent, and that's a significant authority to require compliance. And then the fourth, I would argue, would be the office itself commands respect, in my experience.
So if there was an agency, and technically the legislation, the agreement, the regulation may not give me as the minister the authority to intervene directly. But as a minister, to pick up the telephone and to say, look, Mr. President or CEO or Chair of the Board, we have a problem here. I'd like to have a meeting. I'd like to have a discussion with you. We need to set some things right. That is a very powerful way, very effective way to get the attention of the leadership of that organization. And I'm assuming that it's your experience that a minister would have a great deal of persuasive power simply by exercising that.
Well, many ministers use many techniques. I wouldn't presume to advise ministers on how they conduct their own business. But in my experience, ministers command attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move on to the NDP. Ms. Jellams.
Good morning, Mr. Sapsford, and I thank you for
Madame
coming.
Julien, ça va bien?
Ça va, merci. I thank you for coming to Queen's Park.
Yes.
You're very familiar with this setting and this room and everything else, so I'm going to build a little bit onto the line of questioning that Mr. Klees was doing. But I'm more interested in your experience. How do issues get brought up to the attention of the minister for action? So what I've been trying to understand is that from where I'm sitting, there were many warning signs that something was not right at Orange. So we in the NDP file a freedom of access of information for why is it that Mr. Maz's salary Dr. Mazza's salary was no longer on the sunshine list. We file this. We get a response back telling us that 19 records have been found, but none of them can be shared with you. We consider this as telling the government that, hey, have a look, because we've had whistleblower come to us telling us that Mazza is now pocketing close to $1 million. You guys should look into this. So we did. We filed freedom of information. Then estimate comes around. You're very familiar with those. You've attended many. And I'm the health critic at that point, but I'm subbed in for my leader. My leader comes in. It was Howard Hampton at the time. And Howard spends the entire afternoon asking about one topic. Healthcare is huge, and we usually carry, like community health centers and hospital and all this, but we don't talk about anything else. We talk about one topic, Orange. Howard will ask 47 questions about Orange during that estimate that cannot be answered. We get a promise of an answer, but no answers ever come for any of the estimate questions till 2 years down the road. Then we have whistleblowers, more and more whistleblowers coming to the NDP that also tell us that they have gone to different levels of the ministry. Some went to the wrong ministry, went to the Ministry of Health Promotion, but a lot of them actually went to different departments and basically talked to the minister, try to communicate that things are wrong at Orange. They are making decisions right now that taking money away. They shared with them what they could, that like level of patient care is going down. Some of the decisions that are being made, hey, we have rumors that Dr. Mazza's salary is going to hit the moon, etc., etc. So at what point does an issue like this register with a ministry the size of the Ministry of Health?
So just before I try, could I just get you to agree with me that the questions at estimates, because you referred to me being at estimates, the questions you're referring to...
You were not there.
I was not there.
No.
Thank you.
You're not the one.
Well, questions at estimates are always answered. In my experience, that's part of what the role of estimates is. So if you're saying the questions weren't answered, I can't offer you an opinion as to why. I don't know why. In my experience, generally, questions and estimates were followed up and answered.
So we cannot think of a valid reason why questions and estimates would not be answered, and neither can you?
Well, unless the information wasn't available, the minister couldn't get the information. I can think of reasons why perhaps not, but in general, questions were answered and are answered.
I agree with you. In this point, they were not. So my questions to you is, I'm trying to understand what needs to happen within the Ministry of Health to pay attention to one of its thousands of transfer payment agencies. I mean, Orange was but that. The Ministry of Health have thousands of transfer payment agencies. You had a transfer payment agency that, in my humble opinion, was running amok. We had the NDP had a few whistleblowers come to us, so we filed freedom of access of information. We concentrated all of our question and estimate on Orange to try to get answers, because you don't always know if the whistleblower is telling you the truth or not. So
yes.
We're trying to get information. We know that whistleblowers are going directly to the ministry, but yet no actions get taken for months. That turns into years. That turns into 2 years. I'm trying to get from you, I'm sure there must have been other instances where you paid attention to one of the thousands of transfer payment agencies that was within your portfolio. How much smoke does a fire must do before you notice that there's a fire?
Well, it's a hard question for me to answer as I sit here today. I'm quite certain the ministry would not ignore information, and so if questions were asked, I'm quite certain the ministry would go about trying to find out. As I've already said, I don't believe the ministry would have ignored Ornge, as you've suggested. The ministry is organized in a way so that transfer payment agencies generally have a recognized contact with the ministry. In this case, it was the Emergency Services Branch. I would expect that they had much discussion and contact with that particular agency over complaints and, other business dealings. So, in terms of the normal way the ministry would operate, there'd be, I would assume, lots of discussion and contact and information exchanged. How then it gets raised, I think, is your question, and that would be based on the kind of answers that were being provided to the questions, if there were answers provided to the questions. So it's difficult for me to evaluate the specifics of it without, frankly, talking to ministry staff and understanding it.
In your time where you were deputy minister, do you figure there could have been a transfer payment agency out there that paid their CEO $1 million and that you wouldn't have known?
No.
That's not, you would have known one way or another, and I take it, take corrective action?
Yes. Well, public transfer payment agencies would be in receipt of public money, which would then invoke the salary disclosure legislation, and that would have been transparent. So I'm relying on that particular process as the mechanism.
Okay. So then we'll go more specific into the story of Ornge, where Ornge decided to create those for-profit entities. And this is how they justified not putting their salary on the Sunshine List. So my questions now are going to be about this decision to have a private entity. In your time at the ministry, how important was the concept of leveraging the expertise, knowledge, skills of the healthcare system, leveraging this to basically promote a way of making money to fund the healthcare system? Because we've heard over and over that what we had at Ornge and what we have within the healthcare system in Ontario is something to be proud of. We have expertise here that can be leveraged, that can be sold abroad to bring money back into Ontario to fund our healthcare system. We have some of the best scientists, some of the best hospitals, some of the best physicians here, and basically we have expertise that we could export. How important was this concept? How was it shared in, I have a hard time with this word, but vehiculated? How was it shared around? Did you understand this?
Could I have maybe the witness closer to the microphone? I can hear Ms. Shellenau very well. I cannot make out what Mr. Sapford is saying.
My apologies.
Very well.
In my words, I would describe that whole notion as secondary or ancillary to the prime purpose of the agencies. So if you want to talk specifically about Ornge, the prime responsibility was to deliver air ambulance services to Ontarians. Period, full stop. Now, it's not uncommon that agencies develop ancillary relationships and try to market, as you said, and sell their services abroad. I'm familiar with cases in the hospital sector, so this isn't in itself an unusual thing. But it's certainly not the prime mover for a health organization. It's kind of a secondary benefit that accrues.
And do they, let's say we take the example of some of the hospitals that do this, do they share what they're doing with the ministry, or are they allowed to go on their own for that part of the ancillary services, as you call them?
No, I would say they do that quite independently. I think, at least in my experience, where those sorts of companies are created, they operate to the benefit of the institution 100%. So they're seen as a subsidiary of it, and any benefit that does accrue accrues to the principal agency as opposed to any other organization.
So it's done either through a foundation or through a not-for-profit, or
no, often it has to be a for-profit organization because of the federal tax implications. Hospitals, for instance, or nonprofits have to protect their nonprofit status, and so carrying on business, ancillary businesses, would be designated by the federal government as having to pay tax on income. And so they're created as for-profit organizations, pay tax, and then any residual benefit flows then to the principal organization.
Is there a mechanism to guarantee that the money will flow back to the hospital? And does the ministry have a responsibility in overseeing that actually does happen?
It's rather the reverse. The concern is not that private money flows to the benefit of the non-profit. It's that public monies are not flowing the other way, so that the funds voted for the health service are used for the health service and not to support ancillary businesses.
And what does the ministry do to ensure that public money isn't used to help start up or to assist in the formation or the creation of those ancillary institutions or organizations?
Well, usually financial review to make sure that funds are not flowing to subsidiary organizations, those sorts of questions. And in my experience, public organizations that do this kind of business are well aware that the protection of public funds is prime responsibility, and so one relies on the prudence and good judgment of boards of governors and management to recognize that fundamental responsibility and to comply with it. That's an expectation.
And that is an expectation, but when that expectation sometimes is not met, for example, in Orange, public money was used in the for-profit side. What role, I mean, as an ADM, what role would the ministry and as an overseer or as an oversight organization, oversight body, would play in ensuring that that doesn't happen?
Well, I suppose the normal review and following up on questions, one has to discover the problem in the first place. And as I understand, I haven't followed all the details of this proceeding, but information was withheld by Orange from the ministry. And so part of, I guess, the problem is how do you find out the information that then gives you the ability to follow up and act on it. So if the agency of record is not being forthcoming or straightforward or non-transparent, then the ministry quite clearly is going to have some difficulty. In reading the auditor's report, even the auditor, provincial auditor, had some difficulty in getting information. So one has to judge the difficulty the ministry faces in this particular case with who was on the other side.
Well, what about the corporate structure and all the decisions along the way being presented to the ministry and to ministry officials? The corporate structure, for example, that allowed for salaries to be withheld, that structure that came into place was disclosed to the ministry. Would that not raise some alarms that this type of structure of a for-profit and not-for-profit is created, and one of the effects of that, which was openly disclosed, which would result in salary not needing to be disclosed?
Mr. You asked me a very difficult question because I don't know the details of the structure. I certainly was not privy to it. It never was raised with me at any time. So these are events that transpired long after I left the ministry, and I really feel unable to offer an opinion.
Okay. So if we look at, I asked you about how did for-profit attached to not-for-profit transfer payment agency usually work. Would you say that when you were deputy, you pretty well knew every transfer payment agency that had a for-profit attached to them, or was not something that we paid attention to?
No, I certainly wouldn't be aware of that.
No.
No.
So the transfer payment agency could have done this, and
Yes.
it wouldn't necessarily have reported that to the ministry.
I'll give you one example. For instance, I learned in the normal course of my business, hospital had a contract in China to offer expert advice on hospital services and so on and so forth, and that was conducted through a subsidiary. So one would hear of these sorts of things, but there was no formal tracking that I'm aware of in the ministry of those sorts of organizations.
Knowing what we know now, do you figure the ministry should track this?
We talk in our healthcare system a lot about innovation. We talk a lot about improving our healthcare system through innovation, and innovation to some degree implies risk. And so I think that the healthcare system needs a certain amount of freedom to explore innovation and then to apply it to the benefit of our own healthcare system. What I think is the important point is to make sure that public monies are not flowing in the wrong direction. So I don't have a problem with people undertaking innovative business approaches to try and improve healthcare or benefit or lever, I think was the word you used at one point, our knowledge and expertise. The important point is to keep the public and the private separately and to ensure that public funds are not used for private purposes. This is such a well-accepted rule and understanding in my experience that to have to track it in some minute detail for every single agency, I don't think it is a particularly productive use of anyone's time.
Very good. Okay, I'll use my last 2 minutes. The members of the boards and chair of the board at Orange were paid $200,000 a year for their membership on the board of the not-for-profit transfer payment agency that was Orange. In your time as deputy minister, do you know of any other transfer payment agency that paid their board members that amount of money?
No.
Do you know of any transfer payment agency except for CCAC and LINS that pay the members of their board of directors?
For not-for-profits?
Transfer payment agencies
well,
of the Ministry
yes,
of Health.
transfer payment agencies, yes. Don't forget, a large part of our healthcare system is delivered by private companies.
True.
So
labs and pharmacy.
Long-term care homes would have private corporations whose boards, I suspect, are paid.
Okay. Let me phrase this then. Not-for-profit transfer payment agencies.
No.
So not-for-profit transfer payment agency, you had hundreds and hundreds of them, and not one of them paid their board of directors to be on the board?
Well,
Like
none that I'm
stipends?
aware of. It's certainly not common. I mean, there may be one or two for very specific reasons, but it's not a common thing. Most boards who are responsible for public health agencies of a variety of sorts usually serve on a voluntary basis, and certainly even if usually costs are covered, so directors incur expenses in the course of their duties, those would be offset by the agency. But payment of the kind you're talking about, I've never heard of.
You had never?
In my whole career.
Okay. We'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. We'll move to the government members. Ms. Sanders.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Sapsford,
Good morning.
and welcome back to Public Accounts. You've been here on all sorts of topics in your role as deputy in the past, and just that I recognize that this development of Orange or Ontario Air Ambulance was well underway when you arrived, and I think you've said here March of 2005 as deputy, so that was happening. From your earlier conversation with Mr. Klees, I wasn't quite clear on exactly when it was you first met Dr. Mazza. I don't
I'm not
expect
clear
a
either.
date, but sort of...
Well, it would have been It would have been at the earliest in 2006, could have been into 2007, somewhere in that.
But this is essentially after by this time the Ontario Air Ambulance actually exists.
Oh yes, I
And
met
he's
him
the
as the
CEO.
CEO of Orange, yes.
So it wasn't, because what seems to be, what has always puzzled me is that there seems to be a long period of time when Dr. Mazza served, I don't know, as a special advisor to the ministry or something, but he seems to have had this relationship with the ministry above and beyond simply doing his job at Sunnybrook at the base hospital as it was then. And there seems to have been this appointment of him as a special advisor, and as Mr. Klees alluded, we did have testimony from Mr. Bates that Dr. Mazza was effectively put in control over the air ambulance program at this, developing this, and that most notably during the design stage of the performance agreement, he was the go-to person. So when you came in as deputy, did anybody ever sort of bring it upstairs and brief you on this somewhat peculiar arrangement?
No, would be my simple answer. I think, in fact, Dr. Mazza had left the ministry, frankly, before I arrived. Now, I stand to be corrected on that.
Okay, so
But I think his role as special advisor predated the detailed delivery of the final package of information to Cabinet.
Okay,
so I never had any contact with Dr. Mazza in the Ministry of Health. It was always as the CEO. And I believe, I stand to be corrected, but I think he had left the ministry.
Okay, and that perhaps explains this sort of disconnect, because clearly in a lot of the documentation we've seen around the legal billings for the early development of the performance agreement, it backs up what Mr. Klees alluded to, it backs up what Mr. Bates told us. It was quite clear just from the notes of the day that Mazza was the go-to person in the early framing of performance agreement and early structure of the corporation. But you're saying you think that it was so far developed when you came that he'd done that early work and he'd sort of moved off again.
That would be my best understanding, yes, that early work had been done and he left, and then the discussion around the formality of the service agreement was after that.
So do you have any knowledge then of why this, to me, very odd structure was set up, that the person who was going to be the eventual CEO of the corporation was essentially given responsibility for negotiating the performance agreement? I mean, it was almost, it appears as if Dr. Mazza was negotiating with himself.
I don't know the answer to the question. I just simply don't know. It may be that events transpired in an order, and where they started and where it ended up were two different things, but I don't know.
Okay, because it just seems so odd that somebody negotiates their own performance agreement, and it may be why you're unclear on who the lead negotiator was. That the lead negotiator was, it sounds like, was actually Dr. Mazza, as I say, negotiating with himself. So that may be why you're sort of struggled with the early question about who was the lead negotiator. The other thing that has always seemed quite peculiar to me, because I'm certainly aware, as are you, that there's a whole host of lawyers at the ministry, is why it was that negotiating the Ontario Air Ambulance side of the performance agreement seems to have been farmed out to Faskins, an external law firm, but was paid by the ministry as far as we can figure out. And Faskins appears to have been on the performance agreement development file as early as January of 2003. So was this ever raised as an issue to you, that much of the legal work on developing the performance agreement had in fact been done by an external law firm who saw themselves as representing OAA as opposed to representing the Ministry of Health?
So as I understand it, the corporation itself was created in, I think, 2004. The Air Ambulance Corporation, and my understanding is that your reference to Faskins were that corporation's lawyers who
But they were billing as of January 2003.
Well, then it started earlier than that.
Yeah, so
that only tells me
it seems to me a very odd. So nobody raised this as a plague when you came in as deputy, that you need to go back and look at the legal history of who was negotiating with whom.
No, my understanding coming to it was that the corporation out there that was receiving the air ambulance as part of the divestment had been created. There had been negotiations with them over a period of time. And I wasn't aware that it was necessarily Fasken at that point in time, but they would have been the lawyer representing that external corporation. As to why the ministry would pay, well, it would seem to me they were already treating it as if it were a transfer payment agency, and so the costs of setting up the corporation, going through the divestment, making sure that the agreements were in place would have been considered part of the transfer payment cash flow.
Mm-hmm. Because that was certainly part of the payment trail to Faskins that the auditor identified, was the payment trail starting in January of 2003.
Well, the corporation wouldn't have had any other revenue source other than the ministry, and so as the receiving organization, I suspect, I'm a little out on edge here. I suspect...
Well, this is what we're all trying to figure out, is why was it set up this way, because it didn't seem to be the way in which it would best protect the interest of the ministry, necessarily.
Well, but my view of that would be the ministry would be on the other side of the discussion, negotiating with the external organization over the divestment and the service agreement and so on and so forth. The ministry would be representing its own interests.
Okay, so there were two sets of lawyers.
Yes, that would be the way I would.
Once OAA had been formally created, the service was turned over. Would you have met with Dr. Mazza other than that one meeting at all?
No.
Where would you get reports on how this was unfolding? Did you get an impression of how the divestment was going, how the creation of the operation was going?
No, I didn't receive regular reports. I think the way, in terms of operational detail, things would be reported to me on an exceptional basis as opposed to a routine report. I was aware, I think actually through an audit report shortly thereafter, in terms of the operation of Air Ambulance, and I think I appeared in front of this committee. So I was certainly aware of some of the issues affecting Air Ambulance as a result of the provincial auditors.
But there wouldn't have been a routine follow-up, we've created this new thing, and sort of just routine reporting that would come up as far as...
Unless issues were raised by ADMs to me directly.
Okay. Now, the thing that seems to have obviously happened sometime in here is this moving to a global operation. And we certainly know that there was extensive briefing in January 2011, after you had left, obviously, around this big new structure. But it's clear that the board passed that in January 2010, and that there had been a lot of prior work go into it. Did you ever get any, in this chain of flagging issues? Did it ever come up to you that Ornge was starting to work on a new corporate structure?
No.
So that was never raised as an issue to you. So we know then, as I say, that Ornge moved a lot after you left. One of the things that did seem to come up earlier was the decision to move to the air ambulance. That setting up the corporation, the bond holding corporation, to actually get into purchasing aircraft happened earlier. Did that come up to your office when they started to move to the purchase of
No.
aircraft? So that didn't come up as a flag to the level of your office, because clearly that did start before you left, setting up that
I
structure.
believe that was sometime in 2009, I think.
Yeah, but it didn't come up, again,
No.
it didn't come up as a flag. I mean, obviously, you've been following some of the media, given what time you have from all your other responsibilities that you've got now, and we've certainly been hearing about outrageous salaries, bonuses. We've been hearing about, the girlfriends, the daughter of the board of chair of the board getting big jobs, public funding going to people getting university degrees. When you hear about that now, do you have any thoughts on where this went off the rails, how it got off the rails? Where did Dr. Meza sort of go astray? Because I think what we all keep asking ourselves is, what went wrong, and how do you make sure it doesn't happen again?
It's a very hard question for me to answer. When one hears, well, certainly reading the auditor's report raised my eyebrows in a number of areas and led to questions, many of the questions I think you've been asking here. It's hard for me to assess what went wrong. I think one has to look very seriously at the decision-making of the agency itself as to what they had in their mind. And somehow it shifted from operating public air ambulance services to a whole series of other business ventures that somehow seemed to put Ornge as subservient. Now, that's just my view looking from the outside. Why that happened, how it happened, what decisions were taken, I don't have those answers.
You mentioned that this is the second time you've appeared before this committee on the subject of air ambulance, because the auditor did a report, I believe, in 2005, and you were here in, I think, February 2006. And I believe Mr. Zimmer and I have been around long enough that we were here too. So I dug out some of that testimony, and I certainly don't expect that you're going to remember in any detail who said what to whom. But the auditor had been looking at the air ambulance service largely because he would have been in there doing his audit work in 2005, early 2005. So his work had to do with largely before the service was divested. When we go and look at the conversation that we had at Public Accounts and your testimony and Mr. Bates' testimony, it was largely about what is Ontario Air Ambulance going to look like now that it's being divested, because this policy change had happened between the report and you appearing at the committee. So one of the things that that stands out, so you focused on the creation of Ontario Air Ambulance. Do you recall what you saw as the benefits of creating Ontario Air Ambulance from a public policy point of view? Because there were obviously problems that had been identified by the auditor, and Ontario Air Ambulance was looked on as the solution. Can you recall why the structure was the solution as seen at that time?
I'll try, but
Yeah.
are you, maybe you'll tell me what I said. Well, I think in answer to a previous question, it was to create an organization that was spending full time focused on the delivery of that service. If I remember some things about the audit, there were coordination problems, standby problems, there were employment issues, there were a whole series of problems in having the service available when needed. And so creating an organization that would specialize this and understand the business from an expert point of view to find the solutions and to manage it on an ongoing basis would be, in my mind, the principal policy reason.
One of the things that's sort of stands out in a way is what we didn't discuss. So there was, mention of it being, I think, a non-profit. There was no discussion of alternative revenue in the model. So would that be consistent with your understanding at the time that there was never any discussion that came to you as you were reviewing the MB20, the cabinet submissions, that there was never any discussion there of setting up these side for-profit corporations?
Not to my memory, no. I mean, as I've said, the principal reason was to divest to the non-profit the operation of the air ambulance service. That was the prime motivation.
Yeah, and certainly your testimony at the time doesn't reflect any thought of creating for-profit entities. Okay. The other thing, one of the other things that has been a big issue is the whole business of buying their own aircraft. And again, you've said that it didn't come up to you as a briefing issue. Do you ever recall, and it's clear from your testimony again, that the model that people are talking about is still procuring the actual flight services from independent private aircraft operators. That's the model that it's very clear from your testimony that you thought. Was there any ever discussion that you were briefed on about the pros and cons of owning aircraft at OAA versus contracting out to private carriers?
No.
So it isn't that something didn't get mentioned in the testimony before the committee. It was simply that there was never any discussion of switching models.
No. But I will say, I mean, part of the model was to put those sorts of considerations and decisions into the hands of the air ambulance operator, so that I can't say I would be surprised that they might choose to do that. It's in the lexicon, it's a make or buy decision, whether you contract it or offer the service yourself. So it was within the authority of the corporation to make those sorts of decisions. But it wasn't contemplated at the beginning.
Okay. And that's very helpful to make that distinction. It just, going back through the testimony, isn't something that we discussed.
No.
But it would have been within the authority. That's helpful to know. Okay, thank you, and we'll come back later.
Thank you. We'll move to the opposition. Mr. Klees.
Thank you. As usual, we're running out of time. I'm sure that you would rather stay here for another day as well, right?
Please don't invite me.
Mr. Clerk, does Mr. Sapsford have a copy of this? We're trying to wrestle with this issue of where things went wrong and who knew what and how early did the Ministry of Health know that this was developing into something beyond what was originally contemplated. I've just handed to you and members of the committee have in front of them the recommendation section of the Myers-Norris-Penny report that you may or may not be familiar with.
I'm sorry, this is
the summary of that report, the Myers-Norris-Penny report, which all members of the committee have. And this was, the final report was delivered September of 2010. So you may not have seen this.
Never.
Okay.
No. This was as a result of the audit that was going on.
This was a report specifically ordered by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care to assess the performance of the Ontario Air Ambulance System.
Okay.
Okay? And the reason that I wanted you to have a look at this is that as early as July 16th of 2010, which is the date of this summary, it included that interesting corporate structure, and that was, some of us saw this for the first time in a letter that was distributed to the minister in, it was January of last year. But this report that was delivered to the Ministry of Health back in September, at the very latest of 2010, already has this organizational chart growing. And it already has a number of for-profit entities. It has the J. Smarts not-for-profit foundation. It has the Orange Peel. It has a numbered company that currently, at that time, was inactive. But they had some plans for this. And the reason I show this to you is that the recommendation from Myers-Norris-Penny, the first recommendation was, and I'll quote, "The organizations must discuss and document the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's concerns regarding Orange's corporate structure and enter into agreed-upon revisions of their contractual relationship, if any, that are required to give the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care more comfort regarding Orange's corporate structure and its impact on the delivery of air ambulance services in the province of Ontario." This was a fairly strong message to the Ministry of Health back then. It was another red flag in the whole lead-up to the mess that we find ourselves in. My question for you, sir, is if you were the deputy minister at the time, I realize that it's hard and you may not want to go there, but I'd like to challenge you too. Something as important as this, with this kind of corporate structure, would that have given you any cause for concern, and would that have prompted you to say, look, I think we need to ask some more questions about this?
And is just a question of clarification, this chart that I'm looking at on the back page?
Yes.
Is this part
that
of
is corporate? That is part of that report.
I would want to ask questions. Clearly.
I thought that you probably would. What concerns us at this committee is that, again, this is information that was in the hands of the Ministry of Health at the time, and it seemed that no one was particularly concerned about it. I'd like to...
Well, then I don't know, though, sir, whether... I don't know what questions were asked, so I wouldn't assume the ministry didn't.
Well, here's the interesting thing. There was an even more comprehensive briefing, about a 43-page letter, with an organizational chart that was twice as complex as the one that you see there. And we have had testimony from the deputy, from the assistant deputy, from the minister, and not one person indicated to us at this committee that gave them any cause for concern. And we're wrestling with that. Because from our standpoint, given the oversight responsibility that the Ministry of Health had, and seeing how this organization was apparently spinning out of control, it just baffles us that somebody did not stand up and say, look, let's put the brakes on here. Let's call Mazza and his board in here and let's have a fulsome discussion about where the priorities should be. Because, sir, at the same time that this organization was spinning into international businesses, they were having meetings with paramedics in London, Ontario, saying we may have to shut this base down because we don't have the resources to carry on. And if that isn't a problem, if that isn't something that even the first person in line for oversight would have to respond to, we don't know. And that's why at this committee we're wrestling with how do we get a handle on dealing with this issue, because we can make as many legislative changes as we want. We can make as many changes to a performance agreement as we want. And if the individuals at the Ministry of Health who have oversight responsibilities are not sensitive to what can go wrong and are not exercising their proper oversight, we're right back to square one. And I guess my question to you, as a former deputy, is how do we get the attention, or how would you get the attention of the people within your ministry who have that oversight responsibility to do their job?
And after the answer, we'll move to the NDP because you're out of time.
Mr. Klees, in my experience, the Ministry of Health, and I've worked in the ministry on 3 separate occasions, and I've been on the receiving end of the ministry my whole career as well, has, in my experience, always treated its responsibilities of oversight and due diligence extremely seriously. In this particular case, I can't answer all the details of it because I'm not aware of it. I again would point you to the fact that the kinds of decisions that were made by this organization are atypical. They're not typical of what one would expect. And so in presenting this set of facts to the ministry, there may have been some difficulty in understanding or following up or not getting answers. But my experience is that the ministry staff are extremely diligent and pay attention to things that go wrong. And I can give you lots of instances where, in fact, that's been the case. From my point of view, you're dealing with an unusual circumstance as opposed to a fundamental problem with questions of oversight from the Ministry of Health. And that would be my reflection to you.
Very well. We'll move to Ms. Gillimus.
All right. So I tend to agree with you, having been at the receiving end, that the Ministry of Health usually does a good job of oversight. You, as the executive director for many years, I had to account for every penny that I received, and they watched and they asked questions, and they took their job seriously of making sure that the money that had been transferred to my agency was for the accountability agreement that I had signed with that the board had signed with the ministry. So if we take for granted that this amount of oversight that we see throughout the Ministry of Health was applied to Orange, and yet we have the bad turns of event that has happened at Orange, as the Auditor General has put in his report. We have the 1.4 million salary, we have the personal loans, we have the $200,000 to the Board of Governors, we have this spaghetti of a corporate structure that makes no sense to anybody to this day, except for a lawyer who designed it. We have all of this. So the ministry, we'll take it for granted, did a good job. They knew that something was drastically wrong, and they tried to act. Then you're left with this this was allowed to go on because somebody wanted it to go on. Neither one of those scenarios I like too much. In going into the experience that you've had, not all transfer payment agencies of the Ministry of Health, I'm sure, were charming to deal with. Using your experience, what other scenarios could there be out there that would explain why this went on for years?
Well, I think, first of all, remember the most difficult parts of this whole story were not decisions of the ministry. Let me start there. I think how one discovers those kinds of things is the difficult part of this. And what I understand of the overall position is that information was kept back and actions were taken that were not revealed, and things were done behind closed doors and difficult to discover and understand. I think if you start there, then the problem becomes, well, how do you catch up with that? And I guess in this particular case, it took the provincial auditor's report to do that. I think I looked briefly at the response of the ministry to the auditor's report, and I think some of the suggestions that were put forward by the ministry as action as a result of it were useful things to do. So in terms of how do we ensure it doesn't happen again, if I'm reading that to your question, I think some of the proposals that have been put forward would do that. They dealt with following the money, tracking the money, making sure if there were certain kinds of actions to be taken by an agency, there needed to be an explicit approval. So some of those techniques, I think, are important considerations.
Okay. So the premise of this discussion is that the ministry did not know, therefore could not act because they did not know, and it was basically an agency that hid things.
Well, it strikes me that that's the fact.
Yeah.
It strikes me that that's the fact.
And a huge part of me wants to believe this, except that there are so many documents and testimonies that have been presented to us that it makes this hard to believe. It makes it hard to believe that why is it that whistleblower were telling us that his salary was over $1 million. The whistleblower came and testified that they've also told the ministry. So, you know, like when we ask for freedom of access of information to find out what his salary is, wouldn't the government find out what his salary is? That's a question.
Oh.
That's very good.
Yes, one would attempt to, for sure.
One would attempt to, for sure. I agree with you. When questions are asked in estimates, that has to do with the corporate structure, that has to do with the money going to the for-profit entity of what was Orange Peel and Orange Corp and all the other for-profit Orange. That was also an opportunity to get to learn about what they were hiding from you, what they were hiding not from you, you were gone, what they were hiding from the government. So when questions are posed in estimate, wouldn't that be an opportunity to learn what they're trying to hide? Especially if the questions were pointed. What is this corporate structure? Where does this for-profit got his money? With a promise from the deputy and the minister to get back to us. Do you consider this an opportunity to find out what they're trying to hide?
You have a minute and a half.
Well, yes, to ask the question, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you agree with the position that there may be transfer agencies that improperly handle money? There may be transfer agencies that don't do their job that they're supposed to properly. That may occur again and again. And simply finding a transfer agency that's making a mistake and saying, oh, this one is making a mistake time and time again, looking at the agency itself those mistakes may occur again and again. But a systemic or a systematic approach to the problem would be to have better oversight on a consistent basis so that the government can prevent this from happening. Instead of looking at, for example, Orange and saying that it was Dr. Maza who didn't disclose, who withheld information, that may happen again. We can't prevent that. But what we can do is ensure that the ministry has sufficient oversight so that it catches these issues early on before taxpayer dollars are wasted. Do you agree with that approach?
Well, I think you need to remember there are different legislative schemes or regimes for different parts of the healthcare system. So I would argue in a systematic way the Ministry of Health has huge ability to oversee and to make sure that services are delivered effectively and, without things going wrong. But there is no legislative scheme that will prevent things from going wrong, and how government responds, of course, is the more important thing. So one can look at different kinds of legislative models and apply them differently. There's not the same regime is not applied to every single health service. And I think the learning from the auditor's report is, and the ministry, in fact, has followed in its response, to borrow from other models some additional protections that weren't applied in this particular case, that on hindsight, and hindsight is perfect, that could have and perhaps should have been in the past. But I think in terms of the fundamental structures and accountability mechanisms and so forth, I think they're strong, intact.
Very well, and we'll move to the government. Ms. Sandals?
Yes, thank you. Just finishing up on the testimony and the conversation back in 2006, and I noticed you said the same thing again today, that Orange was envisioned as a transfer payment agency. It wasn't envisioned in the way that it turned out. Anything in particular that you can identify that is key in trying to make sure that that loss of transfer payment agency behavior, where, as you mentioned, it seems to not be focusing on public interest but rather private interest, is how do you draw that line, given that public interest or that private entities may be acceptable? How do you enforce that line that you keep the governance model focused on public interest, even though there may be private for-profit offshoots?
Well, I think in the ministry's response, the ministry offered a couple of those. One would be specific approvals on large capital transactions, prohibition on movement across corporate lines for assets that are flowed to the public agency. So those sorts of occasions where those kinds of business changes are anticipated, then with a specific approval, would bring the question back to the ministry, at least for review.
One of the things that is in the legislation that has been, is before the House but has not been passed, is giving the minister the ability to appoint a supervisor, much akin to hospitals, CCACs, other health entities. Is that a useful fail-safe that you have, that the minister has the ability to put the agency under, well, the transfer partner under supervision?
Yes. Yes.
So you would encourage us then to make sure that that ability is in place as well?
Well, the minister has authority over a number of health agencies, so.
But unfortunately, not under this.
Yeah.
The existing legislation did not allow for that. So that would be a useful legislative step.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very well. Thank you very much for coming before the committee.
Thank you so much
this morning. Appreciate it.
He's on the line, so.
Okay, and our next presenter witness is coming to us by a teleconference, and he's on the line, and that is Mr. Hugh MacLeod. Can you hear me, Mr. MacLeod?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And if you want to, first of all, either, I guess, swear an affirmation, or if you have a Bible there, you could do an oath with our clerk.
Affirmation.
Okay, our clerk will go ahead then.
Mr. McLeod, do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you shall give to this committee touching the subject of the present inquiry shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
And also to confirm that you received a letter giving information for witness testifying before the committee?
Yes, I did.
Very well. Then go ahead with your opening statement then, Mr. McLeod.
Good morning from Edmonton, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Hugh McLeod. I have a very brief opening statement. First, I'd like to lay out for you a brief overview of my Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care work experience, and secondly, provide a high-level chronology of my experience with base hospital air operations, Dr. Chris Mazza, in the Emergency Health Services branch. First, turning to my Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care work experience. In the fall of 2002, I was headhunted for my position as Senior Vice President, Vancouver Coastal Health. In December of 2002, I signed an employment offer with the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care as Assistant Deputy Minister, Acute Care Services, and within that responsibility included base hospital air ambulance operations. In February of 2003, I commenced employment as ADM for Acute Care Services. For the period 2003 to July of 2003, I managed a SARS Command Center for Care Coordination and Transfer. For the period August 2003 to 2004, I performed the full role of the ADM Acute Care Services position that I was recruited to. In July of 2004, I moved from ADM Acute Care Services file to set up the Health Results Team. The team was responsible for reducing wait times for cancer, cardiac, cataract, hip, knee, MRI, and CT, create the 150 family health teams, and the LIN structure. Between July 2004 to July 2004, began the transition of my ADM portfolio, including base hospital air ambulance operations, to another ADM, and began recruitment for the Health Results Team. In December 2004, a formal announcement was made that I was appointed the Associate Deputy Minister and Executive Lead of the Premier's Health Results Team, and with that announcement included the names of the Health Results Team leads. In mid-2007, there was a reorganization of the ministry with a new organizational structure. The deputy at the time gave me the position of Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for the wait time file, the family health teams, the LINs, provincial programs like cancer, cardiac care network, renal dialysis, diabetes, and the OMA file. I left the ministry in March of 2008. With respect to my history with base hospital operations, for context, the period would be February of 2003 to September of 2004. In February to March of 2003, a number of briefings by the Ministry of Health, Emergency Health Services branch, including Dr. Chris Mazza, with regards to air ambulance. Key messages from that briefing: one, the Associate Minister, Dan Newman, and his Chief of Staff were strong proponents, and work was already underway on a conceptual redesign of air ambulance services. This was due in part to a number of studies, coroner's cases, and recent audits that identified gaps between dispatch and service delivery. In and around April of May of 2003, we are now in the thick of SARS. I retained the services of the late Dr. Bill Sybil, then Physician-in-Chief, Sunnybrook Hospital, to assist me in managing ICU surge capacity and critical care issues due to SARS. Had many conversations with Dr. Sybil about gaps in critical care, lack of integration, disconnects at critical care transitions, disconnects between dispatch and base hospital. Needless to say, SARS put a spotlight on care disconnects and problems with transitions of care. Sometime in the spring of 2003, Dr. Sybil set up a meeting with myself and Dr. Mazza to discuss the current state of affairs. Dr. Mazza once again shared information about previous studies, coroner's cases, consulting studies, recent audits, all recommending changes to the structure of the AIR program. Dr. Mazza also highlighted the support from the Associate Minister, Dan Newman, and his staff with regards to a reorganization of the program using the Alberta STARS program as a demonstration, but making it the Ontario model. The concept was a nonprofit. The concept was to do it within the existing budget allocation. At the same time, as a result of what we learned in SARS, there's also interest in having Mr. Mazza begin to look at an EMAT, which was an emergency medical assessment team, including the building of a mobile 20-bed unit that could be dispatched in the province in the event of an urgent requirement. Conversations also took place at this time with a number of ministry staff, including Malcolm Bates and staff from the minister's office, to confirm again interest in moving to a new model post-SARS. Direction was clear. We were to move with all dispatch to create a new Ontario model, and that Dr. Chris Mazza would lead the assessment of how this would be accomplished. I seem to recall also around June, July of 2003, a very strong letter that came in from the Land Ambulance Steering Committee, which had representation from a number of municipalities that again shared some significant gaps in care delivery and the lack of action on behalf of the government. On September 4th of 2003, Mr. Bates tabled a document which summarized the meeting called by me to address the air ambulance issue. In October of 2003, new government, new minister, activity on the air ambulance initiative slowed and then stopped. The focus of our briefings were briefings with the new minister, his staff, preparing for the 2004 budget and preparing for and looking at ways to reduce wait times and create the 150 family health teams. I was also aware that during this period that Mr. Mazza had met minister staff to highlight the previous 2002-2003 work with regards to air ambulance. In July of 2004, Dr. Mazza and I met with the minister to discuss the history of the air ambulance. In that conversation, a review took place of the 2002-2003 activity and the need to create an Ontario model, again incorporating the best practices of the Alberta STAR program. Dr. Mazza, in that conversation with myself and the minister, was very clear that the integration of services could be done with little new costs to the system. Following that meeting, an email was sent to Malcolm Bates capturing the spirit of that meeting, and again that Dr. Mazza was to take the lead in the file to develop a slide deck for the minister. In addition, a request was made for a detailed breakdown of all expenditures to ensure to, quote, get the biggest bang for the dollars we have. There were a number of correspondence that Malcolm Bates tabled in July 30th, again confirming the need for a full breakdown, a clear understanding of what monies could be applied, and my asking for complete disclosure. I left the file again and transferred the full transition to the new ADM in September of 2004, and I was made aware in March of 2005 that a formal announcement from the new ADM to all ADMs regard the appointment of Chris Mazza, that he had been retained as a strategic advisor on a secondment, and attached to the March letter of 2005 was an outline of the work that Mr. Mazza was to perform as special advisor. Hopefully that context will assist. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening statement. We'll move first to the NDP for questions. Ms. Jelinas.
Thank you very much. From the personal relationship that you've had and the opportunity to work, we'll start with Dr. Mazza. Did anything ever lead you to believe that we would end up where we ended up?
No.
It came as a complete surprise?
It came as a surprise given that it was very clear from the get-go this was to be create a public sector not-for-profit organization and to provide a much better integrated delivery system that was recommended in a series of reports. So that had always been the intent going in.
All right. So you just said that in 2005, the ADM responsible for Emergency Services Branch announced that Dr. Mazza had been retained as and the word didn't come through. It was almost
on a seconded arrangement as a strategic advisor.
As a what?
Strategic advisor.
Strategic advisors. Thank you. There's a little bit of noise in here.
Sorry.
And so he was retained. So he worked for the Ministry of Health from March of 2005 as a strategic advisor to set up what would be our air ambulance service.
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay. Any idea how long this secondment lasted?
I don't really know because, again, in September of 2004, my focus was wait times, family health teams, and the LIN structure. So I don't recall how long that secondment period lasted.
Okay. But we all know that he ended up taking the job of CEO for Orange.
We know that, yes, we do.
Okay. I will ask you to take a minute and kind of look back. I take it you know the mess that the Auditor General has uncovered at Orange?
I have not read the Auditor General's report, but in preparing for this hearing, I did scan a number of the transcripts, so I have a general feel, yes.
All right. So just to highlight some of it, the Auditor General basically found a number of things that were not in keeping with the original idea of having an integrated air ambulance system, some of it being the creation of a series of for-profit entity. 40 of Orange staff were paid by the for-profit entity. Because it was for-profit, their salary was not disclosed. We find out that Dr. Mazza ends up with a $1.4 million salary. Yesterday we had the human resources person here that also brought in over $1 million in salary. Personal loans were done. Questionable deals regarding a purchase of a building by a for-profit company that is then lent back to Orange for a higher amount of money. We're talking millions of dollars more, etc. So when in all of your dealings with everybody that we're trying to put this integrated air ambulance system together, you, looking back, you never saw any red flags, you never saw any inkling that those people had more motive than they let know?
No, and in fact, and again, looking at Malcolm Bates' testimony and a couple of documents that he tabled, I'm looking at now the September 4 document that speaks to a meeting that I called in the number 1 item, it reads, want to create and in bold print a public sector not-for-profit organization modeled on the Alberta STARS program. And so where this got to was quite a departure from where this started.
Was there any ever discussion about having some for-profit company attached to Ornge to leverage some of the knowledge and skills that we were to develop? Was it something that was ever thought of?
The only area that, in my time on the file, that came remotely close to that was the Alberta STARS program. Again, that was the selling feature, I understand, in 2002 to the Associate Minister of the time. It was also the selling feature when Dr. Mazza and I met with Minister Smitherman in 2004, was the Alberta STARS program had a feature that they could raise through a foundation, sort of charitable donations. And so that would be, from my recollection, the only area where, if you want to call that private and revenue generation, that was the only area that was discussed.
And the auditor wanted to add something to the discussion.
Oh, sure.
I just thought, it's the auditor here, Mr. McLeod. I just thought I'd mention, you're asking about the dates of the secondment of Mr. Mazza to the ministry. There was a one-year secondment from April 2005 to March 2006 with a one-year renewal. I'm not sure whether the renewal was exercised or not.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, because you had put it March, April, close enough. So from 2005 to 2006.
The one-year renewal option.
Okay, because we have testimonies from Malcolm Bates that says that in 2003 you had directed Mr. Bates and other within the Emergency Health Services branch to provide every assistance to Dr. Mazza as basically as he needed. Do you agree with Mr. Bates' characterizations that Dr. Mazza was already controlling Ornge at the time?
I think that's taking some liberty, because if I look at the correspondence that he tabled, it does not say that. It's pretty specific. Again, if I'm looking at the September 4 capturing of the minutes of the meeting that I called, and then the follow-up meeting on September 8th that Malcolm Bates was not even there, and then the October 8th meeting, it all points to a public sector nonprofit organization incorporating the best practices of the Alberta STARS program. The Alberta STARS program did not have all the private models that eventually became part of Ornge, and it was to identify an action plan and bring forward with that action plan the necessary legal framework, I guess eventually the performance agreement, and the sequential investments that were required, and the timelines for moving the project further. So I think a characterization that at that time Ornge as we now know it, was on the radar screen, I would disagree with that.
All right. Fair enough. When would you say that Ornge became on the radar screen?
That I don't know, because I was no longer on the file.
Okay. Do you know Mr. Alfred Apps?
No, I don't.
Okay. He was the lawyer who designed the corporate structure for Ornge. You've never met him?
No, I have not.
Okay, and you've never had any dealings? Okay.
No.
All right. How would you characterize the Ministry of Health relationship to the air ambulance while you were there? As in, was this an important project? How did it fare regarding other duties that were going on at the time?
It was an important project, from my understanding from the briefings in 2003. It was an important project of the ministry and the minister's office in 2002. It elevated its importance, I think, in 2003 because of all of the sort of disconnects that were discovered through SARS. And so there was some urgency post-SARS to move with, if you will, the 2002-2003 plan to develop an integrated air ambulance program. And part, again, what fueled that were all the audits and the consultant reports, etc. And that direction was given to Malcolm and his staff in September of 2003 to move forward, and work began in September and October. As I said in my opening, it then slowed down as a result of the new government, who is now focused on briefings of the minister's staff, getting ready for the 2004 budget, but also looking what they had in on their program, particularly wait time and family health teams. And so there wasn't really much activity in terms of advancing the new design of the air ambulance service in 2004 until, if my memory serves me correctly, the summer of 2004.
Mr. McLeod, this is Jagmeet Singh, MPP. I'm going to be asking you some questions now, sir.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you totally fine. I think everyone else can as well. I'm seeing
okay,
some hands being nodded. Sir, I'm just going to ask you some questions in general with respect to the ministry's role in Orange and in general with respect to any transfer agency.
Mm-hmm.
So would you agree with me that one of the primary roles of the ministry would be to oversee or to provide oversight of organizations to which it provides funding, particularly transfer agencies?
I would agree, and in my time with the ministry, it was a wonderful experience because it was my first time within government. I had spent all my career up to that point in time on the operational side, and I got to see the level of sophistication, the loyalty of what's deemed to be the bureaucracy, and I think they took that as a very important part of their job.
Okay.
Was to ensure oversight. Yes.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And you'd agree with me that transfer agencies sometimes will work in perfect coordination with the ministry and do everything to the standards and maybe above and beyond the standards, but there will also be times when transfer agencies may fall short of that. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, it's an interesting word, perfect coordination. I haven't seen that yet, but yes, in spirit, yes.
And then agencies will have different CEOs or different boards of directors. That may change from time to time, but there is one constant, that the government remains the primary source of oversight.
They remain the primary source of oversight, but within the system there is an understanding that boards will keep to and maintain their fiduciary responsibility, which they all have,
right,
and that CEOs will operate in accordance to, and that we shouldn't have bad behavior.
Right, and in the odd chance that this does happen, that you do have a CEO or a board that doesn't follow the vision or the mandate, it would be the ministry's responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen, or that if it does happen, it stops.
Well, the ministry has a number of, if you will, vehicles at their disposal,
right,
to become involved.
Okay, let's talk about that. So with respect to Orange, one of the initial propositions was that it would be a private or a public entity, a not-for-profit, that would provide a service for Ontarians. Is that correct?
Well, when, again, as I said earlier, when I was on the file, what started, this was to be a public sector, not-for-profit organization. That is correct.
And would you agree with me then that the corporate structure of Orange would be of vital importance to ensure that it maintained that initial mandate?
Well, corporate structure would dictate how decisions are made, the pecking order, if you will, the hierarchy, and who makes the decisions.
Sorry, just to be more specific, that any proposed change to the corporate structure, for example, integrating or including for-profit entities, including other mechanisms of revenue or other mechanisms of governance, that a keen eye should be, or the Ministry ought to have had a keen eye on any changes to the corporate structure that may suggest anything but the public model. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm struggling a bit because I'd have to look at the context before one would make that assessment.
Sure, I can provide some more clarity if you like.
The reason why I say that is I was aware, because, again, I came as the ADM, acute care services, so I was well aware that a number of our large, for an example, academic teaching centers did have, and it's part of innovation, did have opportunities to bring forward new revenue, but always being in compliance with it was never to take any money from the public sector part of the funding to feed those initiatives. Now, if they created a corporate structure within the organization to advance that work, I don't think that in and of itself would trigger somebody in the ministries to say, well, we better get involved.
Right.
So it's got to be within a context, if you know what I mean.
Right, that makes sense. So if you're presented, however, with a corporate structure that suggested a unison between a public side and a for-profit private side, that the corporate structure itself, if it was presented to you as an ADM or presented to the ministry, that would be of importance to assess it, to ensure that one of the most important things, to ensure that the public side wasn't transferring money to the private side.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is I'd want to be assured that there was no transfer of public funds. That is correct.
And you have 2.5 minutes.
Okay. It's come to our attention that there was an audit that was conducted of Ornge, and this audit was conducted sometime. The results of it were presented in July of 2010. The audit was conducted earlier, 2008-9. Are you aware of that audit?
No.
That was the Morris, the MNP audit that was conducted?
No, I have no familiarity with that.
Okay. If the MNP, I'm reading from the MNP's recommendations, they indicate that the number one recommendation, and I'm not sure that the numbers have anything to do with priority, but it says the first recommendation was that the organization must discuss and document the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's concerns regarding Ornge's corporate structure and enter into agreed-upon revisions to their contractual relationship, if any, that are required to give the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care more comfort regarding Ornge's corporate structure and its impact on the delivery of air ambulance services in the province of Ontario. That was a recommendation, and the Ministry's response, written here in the report, was the Ministry will consider this recommendation with input from the Ministry's Legal Services branch. Were you able to hear all that?
Yes, I was.
Do you agree with me that this constitutes a very clear, in your mind, tell me your opinion, but would you agree that this constitutes a very clear red flag that the auditors have flagged an issue that, one, that the Ministry is concerned about the corporate structure, and that the Ministry should proceed to evaluate exactly what's going on and ensure that there are no concerns to address their comfort? Do you agree that this is a very clear red flag about the corporate structure?
You've got me at a disadvantage because I like to see the full report before making that assessment. But it's safe to say, I would assume that whoever that report looked at it, reviewed it, made a decision based on what was in the report. Again, it'd be difficult for me to make an opinion on just what you gave me.
Okay. But in general, you would agree that though innovation is encouraged and innovation is important, that it's essential that the ministry oversee to ensure the way these corporate structures are created to prevent public money from being transferred to the private side.
Well, I think, on that, I think it's clear that is not to happen. The reason why I was hesitating on your question, because in life, if you want someone to be innovative, with innovation comes a risk. And I would not be suggesting, therefore, you micromanage to the nth degree and therefore halt all innovation. However, on the point that you just last made, it is very important to ensure that, again, no transfer of public funds to private endeavor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you, and we'll move to the government side. Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you, Chair. My name is David Zimmer.
Good day.
I have questions, 3 areas. One, the early birth or genesis of the concept of orange. Then I'll have some questions about the use of consultants in the early stages of the birth of orange. And then I have some questions about Dr. Mazza's management style. Let me start first with my question about the genesis or birth of the orange concept. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from Hansard at a previous hearing of this committee. It involves a series of questions and answers from Mr. Klees, a member of this committee, to Mr. Malcolm Bates. I quote from Mr. Klees to Mr. McLeod, to Mr. Bates. Quote, "Why do you believe that Mr. McLeod made the decision to essentially take your authority away and hand it to Dr. Mazza?" Answer from Malcolm Bates, quote, "I believe he was given direction, but I'm not sure. In the information we have, it was direction from, well, I will tell you, back in 2003 firsthand, I know that direction was given by the Minister's Office in 2003 that this particular transfer from the Ministry to a not-for-profit organization was to be accomplished, and accomplished quickly. There is evidence of that as well. In 2004, it carried on in the same vein that this would be accomplished. It was not whether, according to Mr. McLeod, it was how soon." Question from Mr. Klees. "Did you ever get any indication as to where Mr. McLeod's directive came from?" Answer, Malcolm Bates, quote, "As I said, in 2003, it was relatively clear to me because I met with Michael Manjes, I think M-J-A-N-E-S, who was Chief of Staff to Associate Minister Dan Newman. At that particular point, Mr. Manjes was very clear with us that the proponent of this particular service change wanted it done, and wanted it done quickly, and the minister, that is Minister Clement, supported that." You also said in your opening statement, and I think I've got the quote correctly. If I don't, just correct me. You stated that Mazza, Dr. Mazza, claimed support, that is for this orange concept, from Associate Minister Newman and Minister Clement. And you went on to say that it was clear to you from Associate Minister Newman and Clement that McLeod was told to move with great dispatch and that Mazza would be in charge. So what prompted you to come to that opinion that the minister's, Associate Minister Newman's Chief of Staff and the Minister Clement were pushing this orange concept to the extent that they were, and why they seem so, it seems so urgent to them that the leadership for the concept be turned over to MAZA.
Well, just for clarity, not the leadership, but the lead for the development of a potential plan. So on your first question of why, as I mentioned in my opening, in the briefings that I had in that period, February to March of 2003, it was very clear to me that there had been a number of conversations that had taken place in 2002, again, following and as follow-up to the audits, the consulting reports, etc., and the need for a transformation of air ambulance service. I think what elevated the importance of moving forward was SARS. SARS put a huge spotlight on just how fragile the system was and the disconnects. And there were a number of conversations that took place during that period. There was also, post-SARS, there was the David Walker expert panel who are now beginning to look at what lessons could be learned from SARS. There was the Justice Campbell Commission on SARS. So I think all of that together fueled the desire to move quickly to begin the design of a new air ambulance service. And given Dr. Maz's involvement way back into 2002 and going forward, he was the logical choice in the comfort of, at that time, the minister's office to take the lead on the design of what that new design would look like.
Did it surprise you or concern you that this rather a dramatic change of moving air ambulance from its traditional home in the professional Ontario civil service to a private entity, albeit not for profit, under the lead of a non-civil servant? Did that surprise you or cause any concern or second thoughts?
Well, at that point in time, none of that was on the table. The initial work was, again, to scope out the how and what would it look like and what were all the potential issues, and to scope out, again, in the meeting that I called in September of 2003, it was all about, I even said in there, a clear series of questions and answers to potential issues that may be asked by the Deputy Minister. So the lead from Mr. Mazza, because of his familiarity with the program, was to design and deliver a plan. And that plan did not at that point in time include what we now know of as Orange.
So is it your view then that at that time the civil service was, there was no sense that the civil service was being reduced to a secondary role in the development of this plan?
No, in fact, I think the minutes clearly state what Malcolm Bates tabled the September 8th and the October 8th minutes, which is the first time I've seen them because I was not part of those discussions, clearly sets out a pretty onerous set of responsibilities of the ministry in working with Dr. Mazza to develop the plan.
There's been some suggestion from some of the witnesses heard previously here that some of the impetus to drive the Orange concept was emanated from the so-called Red Tape Commission, which was on a mission to reduce bureaucracy. Do you have any sense that that played a role in the shift to Orange from the civil service?
I can't speak to that. I mean, the thought was, again, in the briefings that took place in 2003 and as anchored by, again, the audits, the reviews, etc., that by bringing all the pieces together in an integrated fashion, one of the outcomes should be the reduction of bureaucracy and levels and, if you want to call it, red tape. But that wasn't the primary motivation. The motivation was to build, again, a model built on a very successful model in Alberta called the STARS program, which was truly an integrated air ambulance delivery system.
Did you have any sense that once the Associate Deputy Minister's Chief of Staff, Mr. Manges, got involved in this, and that it was communicated quite clearly that both the Associate Minister and the Minister, and indeed the government of the day, supported this and particularly supported Dr. Mazza's involvement in this, that did you have any sense that Dr. Mazza had any back-channel relationship with the Minister's office or the offices of the government of the day?
No, no more than any other individual in the healthcare system, no.
What do you mean that no more than any other individual?
Well, many times CEOs of organizations would have conversations with the ministry and also with the minister's office, so no more than others.
All right. And let me ask you a question about the use of consultants in these early stages. It's come out at this hearing that a Toronto law firm, Fasken and Calvin, had been spotlighted for billing something in the order of $7 to $9 million as external counsel for Orange and process, setting it up and restructuring it and so on. And we know that Fasken's got involved in the very early stages at the development of the Orange concept. From the documents we've received, the arrangement went something like this. The Minister of Health at the time, Mr. Clement, was obviously interested in pursuing an overhaul of the air ambulance. His choice of lead on that was Dr. Mazza. Dr. Mazza at the time was employed by Sunnybrook, which housed the air ambulance program. Mazza was provided with a team of very senior lawyers and consultants, many of them conservatives who were situated at Fasken's to support him. They were hired via Sunnybrook. Those individuals were Lynn Golding, Minister Clement's wife, Guy Giorno, former Harris Chief of Staff, and Kevin McCarthy, who is currently Minister Flaherty's Chief of Staff. Those folks worked with Mazza to lobby the Minister of the day and other government representatives to work on the setting up of Orange. So in effect, we've got, instead of having the bureaucracy completing the job, they gave it to Mazza and those consultants who got paid through a hospital budget to, in fact, lobby the government to do things for which the government had already said it wanted to do. So were you aware of those arrangements or those that stuff that was going on?
No.
Do you think that type of an arrangement is appropriate in the public administration?
I can't comment because you're bringing something new to me, and I'd have to see the full context.
Do you think that's an effective use of taxpayers' dollars?
To do what? I don't understand the question.
Paying those kind of consultants to lobby the government for to take an approach to setting up Air Orange for which the government had already committed itself.
Well, then I think you've answered the question. If they already committed themselves, I don't know why you do the work.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
Well, you just said they had already committed themselves to doing it. So I'm assuming they had already committed themselves to do it because they believed it was a good plan in the first place.
Yes.
That's what I'm assuming. Again, I wasn't there until 2003, so I don't have knowledge of what transpired prior to my arrival in February of 2003.
When did you first meet Dr. Mazza?
as I said in my opening, sometime between February and March of 2003, and it was part of the usual, the new ADM from the province of British Columbia. So there were a series of briefings, including briefings from Malcolm Bates and the crew in the Emergency Health Services branch and Dr. Mazza about land ambulance, air ambulance, base hospital, etc. So in that time frame was the first time I met him.
And what was your impression of Dr. Mazza? Some people have described him as a charismatic visionary. Other people have described him in other terms. What was your impression?
And my first impression was very bright, very charismatic, good on his feet, and able to articulate a vision and a concept extremely well.
When did you last have dealings with Dr. Mazza?
Oh, this would have been probably, on this file, would have been, I would guess, September of 2004. I did have further dealings with him, and I believe this would have been around 2005, 2006. Now I'm on the wait time file, and I think it was around the summer of 2005, we had commissioned a piece of work, an expert panel on critical care, and the critical care report came down, I think, spring, summer of 2005, and in that report, which was authored by about 65 physician leaders in the province, Dr. Mazza had a role in what we referred to as surge capacity in critical care, and so we had a conversation at that time about what were some options to build surge capacity in the event that we had another outbreak like SARS, but it was nothing really to do with the air ambulance. It was to deal with critical care.
So over your couple of years of working or knowing Dr. Mazza, did your impression or view of his management style or his vision or the way he executed his vision, did it in any way change?
Well, at that point in time, there was actually, while I was on the file, there was no execution of the vision. These were early days of the planning for the redesign of the air ambulance system. So in that regard, I was quite impressed, as others were in 2002, 2003, about his vision for what the air ambulance system could look like. Again, he was very clear in all the briefings, modeled after the best practices of the Alberta STARS program, and that it would be a public sector, not-for-profit organization. So on that, I agreed, and I thought his vision of what this could be was sound. But at that point in time, there was no execution. This was still early days of planning. So I couldn't comment on his execution.
All right.
So now 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So fast forward now, 2012, and looking back over the last 6 or 7 years, and keeping in mind your skills and experience as a professional, as a healthcare administrator, and knowing what you know now of where the Orange concept ended up, where do you think and how do you think it came off the rails?
I guess that's the million-dollar question, or maybe it's a bigger than a million-dollar question.
I'd be very interested in your answer.
That you're all grappling with. I guess on a very high level, something went wrong from what I think was a vision of what could be a very good and integrated air ambulance delivery system on the execution side. And I can't answer the question, what happened on the execution side, but something happened. It's also, again, by looking at the transcripts that I quickly went over, there appeared to be a shift, maybe a distraction, a shift on what was initially to be a public sector organization in the management of public sector funds to some distraction in the creation of a number of private sector entities. And so maybe in all of that distraction, something happened in the execution. Now, that's just my hypothetical based on what I observed, but again, I think when you have two governments, multiple ministries, countless reports that say it's time for a redesign, build on the principles of STAR program, and everybody bought in, it wasn't the plan that was at fault here. It was something happened in the execution.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move to the opposition. Mr. Klees.
Thank you. Good day, Mr. McLeod.
Good day.
I'd like to just pick up where you left off in your discussion with Mr. Zimmer as to how we moved from a vision to a nightmare, which is what I think we ended up with here. I think we all agree that the initial concept had a good direction. We needed coordination. We needed to introduce efficiency into the program. And the fact that two governments saw the wisdom in that certainly seems to at least endorse the direction. What I would like to do is just identify a couple of the components of that so-called vision. And I had the discussion with Mr. Bates as well as a number of others over the last few weeks on this very issue. And the question that I put to them, I'm going to put to you as well, just to see if we have some consistency in what that initial understanding was. And that is this. Was that original concept that was incorporated into that cabinet submission, the MB-20, and incorporated into the performance agreement, did that at any time include the concept of bringing in-house the ownership of aircraft, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, assuming responsibility for the maintenance and overseeing an entire carrier industry?
I really can't answer that because that happened, and I'm not trying to duck it. I was not involved in those conversations. What I can say to you, those questions that you are asking were not part of the deliberations that I was involved in leading up to the building of the plan. So those conversations that you've just put to me were not part of the 2003-2004 conversations.
Yes, and that was really my question.
Yeah.
Was it part of the plan? Because everything that we've seen and what we've heard from other witnesses is that that was never part. I mean, we've looked at the cabinet submissions. We read the original performance agreement. Nowhere is there any reference to this concept of purchasing helicopters, bringing the ownership of those assets into what ended up being Ornge. And what you're saying to me is that you would concur with that that was not contemplated in the original concept that you were familiar with and that Chris Mazza discussed with you. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct, and in fact, I think that's confirmed by one of the documents that Malcolm Bates tabled. I'm looking at an October 8th, 2003 planning meeting, which is the follow-up to the meeting that I asked for in September 4th of 2003. And it begins to lay out the work for the ministry and particularly Emergency Health Services branch. And nowhere in this 6-page document is it surfaced what you've just put on the table.
I shouldn't use the term we, but there are many who have come forward, and I tend to agree with those witnesses who have come forward who have expressed their opinion that Ornge does not have the core competency to take on that massive responsibility of owning and operating a fleet of aircraft. That is something that is highly specialized and should be left with organizations that have the expertise, have the history, and have the competency in place to manage that. Would that be a logical conclusion that you would draw?
Well, I'd have to see, as you know, the diligence of the ministry. What they usually do is seek out that advice, and then put whatever that advice is in front of the ADM or the deputy or the minister. And so I would want to see all of that, and then based on the good counsel from the ministry, make a decision. So I haven't been privy to that. But again, going back to how this started, it was pretty clear that this was not on, if you will, the initial drawing board in 2003, 2004.
And so at the point of time that a policy decision was made within Ornge, because there's no record anywhere of a decision coming to Cabinet that specifically authorizes Ornge to get into that business. So what we have, so far at least, is an organization that was granted a mandate, a very responsible one, that then took it upon itself to expand that exponentially, incur, in order to get into that business, a debt of some $300 million through a public bond offering. And nowhere on record is there any authorization from the government formally to give the authorization to Ornge to get into that business. How does that happen, in your opinion?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I mean, I think that's probably what the purpose of this committee is trying to uncover. And how were decisions made? When were they made? Who was involved? I don't even know what period of time those conversations took place. So it'd be very difficult for me to answer that. I think, though, there's an important piece of context that is missing here, and I know a lot is being made of, my email to Malcolm Bates on July 12th, where it was characterized as putting him completely in charge, and that was not the case. I mean, if you read the email, it says to lead on the file and prepare the necessary slide deck for the minister to take forward. And so that was to convince the minister of the day that all the back information, 2002, 2003, it's still relevant today, it's important. But the last piece is even the most important piece, to detailed breakdown of all the fiscal expenditures. And these are my words, to quote, the minister wants to be convinced that we have tactically set down in direction how we're going to get the biggest bang for the dollars we have. And this goes back again to the earlier conversations. In 2002, in 2003, in 2004, with Minister Smitherman, it was very clear that the original plan could be done within the existing funding envelope, maybe a tweak here and there. And if my memory serves me correctly, at that point in time, the funding envelope was in the range of $90 million. And so this was about using existing dollars wisely in the design of a new system. And I think that's just important context. And so again, I can't speak to what happened. How did it move from, I'm not saying a relatively simple plan, but how did it move from a concrete plan, again modeled after the STARS program, in Alberta, which is not a private sector the way Ornge got to be, what happened in the execution of that? And I can't answer that.
I guess we have our work cut out for us, trying to figure that out, because we're not getting a whole lot of cooperation from very many people. One aspect of this, however, is the whole issue of oversight. And one would expect that if a particular plan is to be executed, then we need someone to focus the organization, and whether it's Ornge or any other transfer agency or organization of the government, that in order to prevent it from going rogue, as this organization has been described by the minister, in order to prevent that from happening, we need in place the appropriate accountability measures and appropriate oversight mechanisms, and someone has to be appointed within the Ministry of Health, in this case, to play that role. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would agree that, and again, as I said earlier, in my time within the ministry, I again, coming from the outside, from the operations side, you have a jaundiced view of how the ministries operate and the level of competency, etc. But you get inside and you really begin to realize these are loyal public servants. These are dedicated professionals who come to work every day to ensure the protection of the public funds, the adherence to legislation and regulation, etc. So I think in the main, they do pay attention. And I guess the challenge that you have is trying to figure out, what happened here? Was it a rogue organization who just kept information private and didn't share the information with the ministry, and therefore it's all to them? Or were there some earlier signals that people didn't pay attention to? Because the ministry does have a series of vehicles at their disposal when they identify, as you say, red flags. They have a number of vehicles that they can become involved. And even on my time on the file and on acute care services, there were times that there were enough red flags that were raised, and proactive action was taken by the ministry, by the minister's office, to address those red flags. So the mechanisms are there.
Well, and you've confirmed what we heard from Mr. Sapsford, who testified earlier. And, he indicated there are really 4 mechanisms available to a minister to intervene if need be. 3 of them are prescriptive in terms of legislation, regulation, and agreements. And the final one is the moral suasion that a minister has because he or she is a minister. And that overrides the first 3, knowing that the minister has ultimate responsibility for administration and oversight. It seems that 4th mechanism was overlooked, unfortunately, in this case. There's another aspect of this, Mr. MacLeod, that I'd like to follow up with you on, and that I'm going to go back to Mr. Bates, who I think did not interpret your email as passively as you're suggesting it perhaps was intended. It was very clear from Mr. Bates' testimony that he took from this email, as well as a number of others that he tabled with us, that this was really a very clear direction to him to stand down. And along with that standing down was also what he referred to in his testimony as a disbanding of the Emergency Health Services branch unit that had oversight responsibility for air ambulance. And as a result of that, the message to us was that notwithstanding the stated mandate of the Emergency Health Services Branch to oversee and to hold accountable this organization, they neither had the authority, which, according to Mr. Bates, was undermined by your direction. How do you respond to that?
And I tried to get a hold of Malcolm prior to my giving evidence. He's on vacation because I didn't want to surprise him about what I'm about to say. I mean, we're asking ourselves to go back in time. It's 2004, so that's 8 years ago. But, you know, what Malcolm didn't produce in the evidence is that before I sent him that email, I sent him the draft of the email. And I said to Malcolm, I'm going to send you an email. Tell me if it's okay. And I don't want to capture all what happened in 2002, 2003. But the essence of the email is no different than the direction that was given by the previous government in 2003. Tell me if you're okay with sending an email. And so he gave the okay. I sent the email. So I'm just trying to clarify for you and for Malcolm the intent. Perhaps what happened here, I'm just guessing, as I went through his testimony, it was quite obvious to me because a couple points, I think you asked the question, how often did you have contact with Mr. Bates? And Malcolm talked about every time he had conversations with him, it was a tirade. And Dr. Mazza was dictating to him. So perhaps what started, I'm just surmising here, again, I have not had an opportunity to talk to Malcolm, which was, I'm not going to say it was passive because it was a direction, but it was basically the same direction that was given in September of 2003. Maybe as a result of the relationship that now emerged, Malcolm began to interpret it to have more direction than was intended originally.
Speaking of relationships, can I ask, over the course of time, as you saw this Orange organization emerging,
yes,
what was your assessment? Because now you started to see Chris Mazza up close and personal. You must have had a very close eye on this because this was a new experiment. There was a lot at risk. It was an important part of health services. Over time, did you get more comfortable with Chris Mazza as the CEO, and did your confidence grow, or did you start to question whether Mr. Mazza was on the right track or whether he was the right person for this job?
And I don't think it changed. I don't think it changed. It didn't change. When you say paying attention to the file, yeah, I was paying attention to the file up until 2008 when I left the ministry. And at that point in time, if my memory serves me correctly, there wasn't a lot of where Orange ended up to be. So there was no reason for me to become alarmed. I only became alarmed later when I began hearing about what was in the Toronto Star and where the organization evolved to.
Was there ever any discussion about this organization between yourself and anyone in the Premier's office?
No.
Okay. You made reference to a meeting that you had with the Minister
yes,
and Mr. Mazza.
Yes.
Was there anyone else in attendance at that meeting?
I believe Ken Chan was there, policy advisor, and Dr. Mazza, during that period of time that I alluded to, late fall 2003 until spring 2004, where new government was preoccupied on briefings, budget, the wait time file that I would eventually have, and family health teams, I was made aware of the fact that Dr. Mazza had a number of briefings with Ken Chan, the policy advisor, again, bringing him up to speed on what happened in 2002, 2003, etc. So I do believe in that July meeting with the minister, Ken Chan was present.
Are you aware of any other meetings that Mr. Mazza may have had with others in government, whether it's policy advisors in the Premier's office or the Ministry of Health?
I'm assuming he probably had a number of meetings with people at the Ministry of Health. Premier's office, no, but I'm assuming probably a lot of meetings with Malcolm Bates and folks with Emergency Health Services, and then post-2005 when he became seconded as special advisor. I'm assuming in that he must have had lots of conversations with the ministry and no doubt the minister's office.
Was there ever a time when you received a specific direction from the Minister of Health or anyone in the Premier's office to get on with this plan?
No. No more than the direction that was given to me following the meeting with the minister to say, begin putting a slide deck to and get a document to me with all the financials. No more than that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll move to the NDP. Ms. Jellens.
Thank you, and nice to talk to you again, Mr. MacLeod. I want to pick up a bit as to where Mr. Klees was going. That is, in one of his questions, you answered that the ministry has a series of vehicles at their disposal if they see that something is happening that seems wrong. Could you, in your experience as an ADM, could you tell me some of the vehicle that is at the disposal of an ADM if one of their transfer payment agency is doing wrong?
Well, first of all, if you combine the legislative and the regulatory, usually that's the first place to start because that begins to give you your legal construct or your framework. You are the funder, so that carries pretty significant clout. And you have the office, and in my time, it was basically three offices. If you have the office of the minister, so a call from the minister, or the office of the deputy, or a call from the deputy, or the office of the ADM responsible. And so, there are vehicles there. When I was on the ADM of Acute Care Services file, and as I said earlier, there were occasions where there were enough red flags that came in that would begin to show a pattern, because that's what the red flags will do. When you bring them all together, it begins to show a pattern. You would then have conversations within the ministry and then with the minister's office, and on occasion, supervisors were appointed. And when that happened, it wasn't just, if you will, the individual coming in as the CEO, but it was also coming in as the board, because typically when you got to that situation, there was actually a disconnect, not only at the governance fiduciary level, but at the operational level. So there are tools available.
All right.
But again, in my experience, probably the biggest tool that you had was you are the funder and you are the ministry. So picking up the phone can get people's attention.
I agree with you. So I guess the question becomes, in the investigations we are doing through public accounts, we're really trying to see, from where I stand, it seems like the red flags were showing a pattern and that action should have been taken before. So some of the red flags started with my party and with the New Democrats. We filed a Freedom of Access of Information in March of 2010 because the salary of Dr. Mazza was no longer being disclosed. Actually, why we did this was because there was some whistleblower that had come to us to tell us that, hey, this guy really gave himself a huge raise, you guys should look into this. So we file a freedom of access of information. The freedom of access of information was answered on June 9th, so a couple of weeks later, basically telling us that they have found 19 pieces of correspondence. I forgot the exact word, but none of them could be shared with us. If you had a freedom of access of information asking for the CEO of a not-for-profit transfer payment agencies of the Ministry of Health, and we asked for his salary, do you figure you would have found out the salary?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the way I feel also. So there was 19 records that could not be shared with us. Then comes estimates time. I know that you've had the pleasure to sit in on estimates and know what the process entails. Well, here again, we're in 2010, and estimate comes around. I'm the health critic for my party, but I am subbed in for my leader. My leader is the one that had been receiving whistleblower information, so he subs in for me for the Ministry of Health estimates and asks 47 questions about Ornge. We don't talk about anything else. No primary care, no hospital, no all sorts of stuff is going on in 2010 solely about Ornge. We talk about the corporate structure. We talk about the salaries not being disclosed. We talked about some issues with quality of care. The ministry is not able to answer the questions, which is fine. They promised to give us answers. No answers were given to the estimates questions till way after the scandal had hit the front page of the paper. We were in 2012 by the time we got answers. Would you consider this a red flag?
Well, first, again, I wasn't at estimates, but I don't know if it was a pleasurable event as you frame it. Let's say estimates were always an interesting event. But the whole purpose of estimates is to ask the questions and to ensure that there's good due diligence on the management of the public purse. And so my experience with estimates is when questions are asked, they're either answered there or there's a follow-up answer. So I can't speak to why you were not provided with answers to the questions, because usually that is the purpose of estimates, to ask the question and get answers to the question.
From where I sit, it looks like we asked those 47 questions. It seems to me like the civil servant would have gone to Ornge and asked them basically a whole bunch of questions, basically ask our questions to them to find answers, and did their work. But the result of their work, of that work, is never shared. Is this the way it usually works? Like, if I ask...
Well, that's not the... So that's, again, I think I've answered before, that's not the way, in my history with estimates, that's not the way it works.
And your time, so we'll move to the government.
Okay.
And who in the government would like to ask questions? Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. McLeod, Liz Sandals here. I wonder if I could get some clarification around a question that Mr. Zimmer asked earlier. You were discussing meetings and who was meeting with whom back in 2003. And with the billings that we've seen from Faskins, it's clear that both Mr. Journo, whom you would know from your past experience with the provincial government, and Kevin McCarthy, who was also working for Faskins, but who's now moved on to be Minister Flaherty's Chief of Staff. It was clear that they were meeting with various political staff in both Minister Clement and Associate Minister Newman's office, and that was going on at the same time as the meetings that you've described in the spring, summer of 2003 that you were holding with Dr. Mazza and presuming other people more at the bureaucratic staff level. Were you aware that those political meetings were going on simultaneously?
No. And I mean, this is a long time, but if my memory serves me correctly, in that time period, 2003, it was my understanding that Mr. McCarthy, I think his first name was Mike?
This is Kevin.
Oh, this is Kevin.
So maybe
okay.
we're talking about two different people.
Okay. Because there was, I think, a Mike McCarthy who was a policy advisor in the minister's office. So, no, I was not aware.
No, this is a Kevin McCarthy who was clearly working for Faskins.
Okay. So, no, the answer is I was not aware.
Okay, because it just didn't sound to me in your chronology that you were aware that there was also in fact, Mr. Journo, and I expect Mr. McCarthy, but Mr. Journo was actually registered as a lobbyist at the time.
Yeah, and I've never met the individual.
Yeah, okay, but you know as Mr. Harris's chief of staff at the time. So I just wanted to check in with you on that particular piece of information. When things started to go astray, actually the other thing I wanted to check in with you is that Mr. Sapsford, who was here earlier this morning, testified that he had never been briefed on or asked an opinion on the whole issue of the whole issue of Ornge buying its own fleet of aircraft. He essentially said what you said, which was that the conversation was always about the aircraft continue to be provided by private operators, and that even though that worked for Ornge to buy their own aircraft was started while he was still the deputy minister, that he in fact had never been briefed on it. You talked about did anybody ask permission? Well, clearly nobody at Ornge asked permission because the deputy minister of the day wasn't involved in a policy discussion about whether or not this was the right thing. Is this the sort of thing that it would be useful to include in performance agreements, in legislation, but as we move forward and look at transfer partners and how do we prevent this, that there actually be an explicit requirement for public sector nonprofits to check in with the government in advance of taking on major capital debts?
That's a big question because, again, you'd have to look at the full healthcare system and ask yourself, is this just one additional impediment barrier to managing of the system? Again, something happened here that you folks are trying to get your arms around, and I wouldn't want to put a cast on the full system who abide by the rules of the day, if you will, are very transparent, have boards that understand their fiduciary responsibility. I think the question is, what happened, and did those conversations take place in that period of time, March of, I think it was 2005, and I think the auditor said until 2006, when Dr. Mazza was seconded. What was the breadth of the conversations that took place then that led to the creation of what you now know as Ornge? And I think those are important questions to ask.
As a general policy point of view, though, what I think I heard you say, and contradict me please if I'm wrong, is as we move forward as a public accounts committee and look at recommendations is that we need to be careful that we don't create another whole round of red tape that clamps down on the ability of public sector organizations to innovate, that we need to find some sort of a balance between accountability and oversight while still leaving public sector organizations the ability to maneuver in ways that benefit taxpayers and benefit citizens receiving services.
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I guess I've been in this business a long time, and when things go wrong, whether it's bad behavior or whatever, everybody else shouldn't be penalized. And good governance is good governance. It's governance that understands their fiduciary responsibility and understand the separation between their role, which is ensuring that the policy frameworks that they create are being administered and followed by the CEO, and particularly in public nonprofit organizations, to ensure that public dollars are used for public purposes and not for innovative private sector purposes.
And interestingly, that's the same line that Mr. Sapsford drew, is ensuring that public dollars are only used for public purposes.
Yeah, well, they have to be, because, again, that's why the dollars were allocated in the first place to the transfer agencies.
Okay. Thank you very much. You've been very helpful, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, and we'll move to Mr. Klees. Mr. Klees?
Yes, thank you. Mr. McLeod, I believe you asked the question once, do we bury or spin bad news to avoid internal and external transparencies that could provide a compelling case for change and suppress the truth in the organization? Do you recall asking that question?
I do.
And I think, we may be facing that. And we may need your help to get us out of this. There's a tendency, whether it's in government or any business organization, to want to avoid the truth because there will be consequences. And I think the challenge that we have in this committee and that the government has is to not only recognize what Chris Mazza and the board have done to go rogue, but if we're going to deal with this going forward, I think we also have to be very honest about what went wrong within the Ministry of Health. The Auditor General, in his report, one of the cautions that he raised was that he made it very clear that, in his opinion, the Ministry of Health failed in its oversight responsibilities. And it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to then determine where that failure of oversight took place and what it is that we have to do to address that to ensure it doesn't happen again. From someone who has been in government in a very senior role, particularly in the Ministry of Health, knowing what you know from the auditor's report, no doubt you've seen reports on these proceedings, what would you recommend we do specifically with regard to the issue of oversight at the Ministry of Health?
Well, that's $1 million question, and I mean that's the whole purpose of why your committee was convened. And I haven't had the luxury of, I don't know how many people have given evidence or about history, chronology, etc. But from an outsider looking in, it's obvious to me that, again, as I said earlier, something went wrong with execution, and both at the board level and at the C-suite level of Ornge. And so I think the question is how much, when you talk about the spin or truth, how much did they hold back? And as a result of them holding back, and I guess you will determine that through your deliberations, caused the situation that you now find yourself in Ontario. On the other side, were there some missteps in the ministry in not following up? And I can't answer that. And if so, what correction can be taken? If there's some tightening that I think, as an outsider looking in, perhaps is needed in future performance agreements that should be signed by both the board and the CEO, would be, I guess I didn't hear all of Mr. Sapp's words, I only heard the last 15 minutes, but it would be clarity on the performance agreement that no public sector funds can be used for any other purpose. I'm not suggesting if that clarity was there and signed off on, it would have avoided some of the execution issues at Orange, but I think it would have probably gone a long way in that regard.
I just have a couple of questions. Leading up to this hearing, Mr. McLeod, have you had any discussions with anyone at the Ministry of Health here?
No, I have not.
And my final...
the only conversation I had was with your clerk, and what I asked for is give me any documentation that made reference to my name.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for taking part in the proceedings today. And we are now recessed until 1 o'clock this afternoon.
Thank you.